It's the same.
Can you click on your email address in the upper right-hand corner?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, refreshing it. It's not doing anything.
What email address are you using to log in?
rayforensics@gmail.com.
Oh, okay. Well, that would be why. I have jcox at
Maribon.
Oh, no, that's an old one. That was a previous one. We had like 5 accounts and we consolidated them all under rayforensics@gmail.com.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm saving that and I'm unlinking your judge. So then you're going to have to link to yourself again.
Okay, so how do I do that? Change Cox linked. How?
I might be able to do it on the back end here. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay, refresh your screen now.
Okay, I got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, I hit start now. Okay.
So what is up to the YouTube for the third, you know?
Just so you all are aware, we did end a little bit late in this round before, so the participants were not asked to come back on Zoom until 1:55.
Oh, that mean we're starting 10 minutes late, or we're going to start on time, or what?
You should be able to start by 3:05.
Okay.
Hey folks, just as you are filtering back in, make sure that you have your naming convention correct. You can do so by going to the participants list. You'll click more and then you'll be able to rename yourselves. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you could please make sure that your naming convention is correct, that would be great in terms of identifying you. I'm also going to ask you all to turn on your cameras so we can make sure that everyone is good to go prior to beginning in just a few minutes. I will also do a roll call again. So just wait for everyone to turn on their cameras and change their naming conventions. Okay, when I call your name, if you could please unmute yourself and just say hi or that you're here or something like that. Okay. Javiri?
Here.
Great. Alex Zhu?
Sorry, I was drinking water here.
No, that's okay. Hi there. Danny Tang?
Hi.
Hi. Emily Donaldson?
Here.
Hi. Karina Wang?
Hi.
Hey. Ashia Mehta?
Hello.
Okay. Aryan Ranjan?
Here.
And you'll be our presiding officer for this session?
Yes.
Great. Make sure that your naming convention is correct.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just give me 1 second.
No, that's okay. Alexander Joel?
Here.
Great. Tiffany Zhao?
Hello.
Hi. Ellie Smith?
Here.
Great. Sarah Faraj?
Here.
Jonathan Hurley? Are we missing Jonathan right now? Okay, come back to him. Excuse me. Michael Bendock?
Here.
If everyone could please be muted, that would be great. Annika Bokiel?
Hello.
Isaac Khan? Isaac Khan? Okay, waiting on Isaac Khan. And Amar Vyas?
Hi, I'm here.
Great. Looks like we do have an observer. We are actually not having observers in the Zoom call, but if you go to Tab Room, you can click on our live stream link where you'll be able to watch this session. We really need to just have the competitors and the judges in the Zoom call to prevent worse lag. We're having some technical issues in the last session. Okay, do we have Jonathan Hurley? Hey, can you unmute yourself just so I can make sure your mic's working?
Yep, we're good. I apologize.
No, that's okay, not a problem. And then Isaac Khan, are you here, Isaac? Okay, we're gonna give Isaac just a minute to hop on.
Parliamentarian, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So if you see a Phoenix Country Day in the bottom, I think it's a duplicate. This happened to me in prelims as well. Would you mind just kicking it off just for the sake of everyone's lag?
Yes, absolutely. That's actually what we're working on. Okay. Thank you for that flag. Appreciate it. Okay, Isaac Khan, are you here? Okay, folks, give me just a minute. I'm just going to report that we're missing someone and then we will get started. In the meanwhile, oh, looks like he has just hopped on. Great. Isaac, can you please turn on your camera and say hello?
Hi, sorry that I'm late. I had a few tech issues with my computer.
That's okay, not a problem at all. Just wanted to make sure that you could join us. Welcome everyone, really excited to begin the second session of semifinals. So leave it out on the floor, do the very best you can, really excited for some great debate coming up. Before we get started, I'd like to have our two new judges introduce themselves. So if you could please do so at this time, that would be fantastic. Julie, would you like to start us off, or James?
Yeah, I'm James Cox from Corpus Christi, Texas. Do you want us to give paradigms?
Yeah, you can absolutely give one.
I value well-constructed speeches, creative arguments, clash, and delivery is secondary to me. I like people to really care about what they're talking about.
I'm Julie Curd. I've judged TOC a few times, but never remotely, so I'm happy to be here today. Also national debates a couple of years ago. My paradigm, I'm interested in quality and directness of the points, evidence-based discussion, interactions with each other, and I tend to like a lot of decorum.
Thank you so much to our judges. It is now 3:01 Eastern time, so I'm going to call this session to order, and I'm going to turn it over to Aryan Ranjan, who is going to be our second presiding officer for the day. The floor is yours, Senator.
Thank you so much, Ms. Parliamentarian. Just a few housekeeping rules that I want to go over. Most of my procedure is very similar to how Senator Donaldson did it last session. She did an amazing job with the cards and everything, so I hope to replicate that in this session. Question time will be done the exact same way. One finger up when you have the 10-second time left, and then the fist will go down when your time has expired. I do want to say quickly that make sure you guys are kind of wrapping it up, because I know with the virtual thing, it's a little bit hard to know when one person's speaking and one person's not. So if you see the hand or the finger go up, at least try to like readjust yourself so that you know when to end. Everything will be the same. Precedence, recency will all be taken into consideration. And I also have set up a Google Sheets for both the judges and the competitors that's going to include speaker order and number of questions, because I know a lot of people were questioning that before. So in an effort to cut back on that time lost there, you guys will always have access to it. And I've put that link in the chat. Just please let me know if you guys are able to use it. Does that sound good with everybody? Yes, Representative Voss.
I know that Senator Donaldson was forced to use like 2 different methods to call in speakers and questioners. Which one are you going to be using?
Oh, yes, thanks for asking. So I will be reverting back to the hand gesture on the participants thing. You just like click the raise hand, and I'll be going off of that. If any of you guys have issues with the placard or anything, just let me know and we can work from there. You good with that? All right, so with that, are there any motions on the floor?
Motion.
Let's go with Senator Mehta.
I move to open the floor for docket nominations.
Any seconds?
Second.
So ordered. Are there any motions for a docket nomination?
Motion.
Senator Faraj.
I move to nominate docket A, which consists of semifinals bill B, A, and then C.
Just to clarify, that's B, A, and C.
BAC for round 2.
All right. Are there any other motions? Senator Zhou.
Motion to close the floor for docket nominations.
Is there a second? All right, so we'll close the floor for docket nominations. So we'll be starting with debate on legislation B. Is there a sponsor present? That'll go to Senator Mehta.
I thank the chair. Hello, everyone. I'm just pulling up a really quick timer for myself, and then go. All right. And judges, just feel free to give me any indication. Thank you. Thank you. Is everyone good? Okay, awesome. Some of us will go our whole lives without realizing the value of a library, the value of a safe space, a bubble shielding us from the political realities of the country, a place to just learn. But in my community, the libraries serve us, and they do across the country. That's why I authored this piece of legislation, because everyone deserves access to an equitable education. Stand with me and pass my bill. First, allow me to explain what my legislation does. In Section 1, we remove all regulations restricting or censoring programming and resources regarding gender, sexuality, sexual identity, family planning, and the criminal status of the subject or author. Why is this critical? Because we increase access to sexual education. The National Conference on State Legislators finds that only 22 states require that if provided, sex and/or HIV education must be medically, factually, or technically accurate. Why is this uniquely important today? Because whenever we universally expand any paths of education, we end up bridging a rural and urban gap that exists between different beneficiaries. This is furthered by the U.S. National Institute of Health, which finds in March 8th of 2019 that libraries are used as a space to provide targeted public health promotions in healthcare through partnerships between public libraries, universities, community organizations, and local governments, just like libraries in my home state of California. In fact, patrons often use libraries to access health information, particularly in rural areas and communities that lack home access. But with restrictions and censorships that occur in libraries right now, certain rural communities are denied access to educational resources more than others. So when we pass my legislation, not only do we open up paths to different forms of education, but we make sure that the access to this very education is standard, because every single child deserves access to a right form of education. But let's look at why my legislation uniquely addresses the issue on regards to solvency. Section 3 finds that the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services will enforce by withholding federal funding from any state or municipal library services by enacting restrictions. This is important because a large amount of state library systems funding even comes from the federal government. Furthered by the California Legislative Analyst Office on April 13th of 2018, that state libraries are promoted primarily by state and federal funding. In fact, the state library's total budget in 2017 to 18 for my home state is $53.5 million, and 39% of the state's general fund for libraries comes from federal funding. So we can see that not only does my legislation effectively tackle the societal issues in regards to equitable education, but proposes a very reasonable way to go about doing this. When we pass today's legislation, we ensure that every single American has access to resources they need to pave a path for themselves. Stand with me, stand with equality, and pass my bill.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please just raise your hand in the participant page. And I'll just give you guys a second to get that through. All right, we'll start with Ms. Wang, Mr. Joel, Mr. Tang, and Ms. Donaldson.
Hi, Senator. A few yes or no questions. Would you say that it's important to establish a relationship between libraries and children and encourage participation in social programs? Okay. What about programs like Cops for Kids, which improves relationships between libraries, children, and the police department?
Sorry, can you repeat that? You cut off.
What about programs like Cops for Kids, which encourages relationships between libraries, children, and the police department? Would you say that's beneficial? Okay.
I don't find any problems with it.
What
Yeah.
does Section 2C of today's legislation do?
Why don't you tell me?
It requires parental consent. So what happens to these social programs once you have to have parental consent?
I mean, I think that parental consent is necessary for a lot of
We'll
things.
go
that
over
children end up
to
pursuing.
Senator Joel.
Great speech, Senator. So we both agree that libraries are crucial for local communities, right?
Mhm.
And so what's the financial position of the majority of the United States' libraries? How do you characterize it?
Probably underfunded.
Very underfunded, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
when we put that restriction in Section 2A, what does that do to libraries' budgets?
It forces them to comply with the jurisdictions under the legislation, as any proper incentive should.
So they have to remanage their budget, correct?
They don't have to remanage the budget. They just need to comply with the regulations in the legislation.
Representative, Section 2A
Senator
says
Tang?
7%.
Can you go through again how passing leads to the impacts you said?
Which impacts the health and
Like
urban impact?
health, yeah.
Okay, so when we pass today's legislation, states that have regulations on like sex education in schools were able to grant students greater access to these resources through libraries. And in rural and urban areas specifically rely on their libraries to access health information more. So when we pass today's legislation and expand access
So
to
it's
health
mostly
resources in
sexual
libraries,
education and so on. Is the one I'm getting at, sexual education.
not just though, like any type
Senator
of health
Donaldson?
education.
Hi, in order to bridge the gap between rural and urban areas, what do libraries have to rely on the most?
Like a lot of different things, like
Ebooks.
access to
They have
internet
rely on
resources.
online services and ebooks, but what have publishers done to change the license requirements for ebooks?
I mean, going by the nature of your question, I'm sure they've changed them.
They've made it much harder to get in price and books at higher prices.
Right.
How are libraries able to get access to them?
There are more like resources that exist besides ebooks. That's such a
And
niche
with
question
that,
for you to ask me.
the questioning time has elapsed. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, all negation speakers, please just raise your hand in the chat. And also, I would just want you guys to make sure that when you raise your hand for the question, to actually get rid of that also, so that the hands don't overlap. All right, we'll go with Senator Bendock.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Michael Bendock. Just a thumbs up when you're ready would be perfect. Great, great, perfect. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. All right. Albert Einstein once said, "The only thing you absolutely have to know is the location of a library." Trust me, I know this because he said this to me in the same year I got elected to the 81st Congress. But I know that I'm old, times have changed, and the way we receive information is fundamentally different. The internet is rendering libraries obsolete, and our lack of foresight may eliminate them entirely. To truly protect libraries, please fail this bill. I want to make one thing very clear. I support almost every single affirmative advocacy, including Senator Mehta's advocacy for sexual education. But please understand that these impacts are contingent upon the assumption that libraries will stay open. Fail this bill because they won't. Section 3 of this bill states that the enforcement of this legislation is the withholding of federal funding from any state or municipal library system that enacts restrictions or censorship. There is a significant problem with this. It assumes that states will give up all attempts at information restriction under the threat of losing library funding, but states are more than willing to sacrifice their libraries. Kansas proves. Thomas of the Kansas City Star reports in January that public libraries that display age-inappropriate material could lose state funding and even see their librarians jailed under a Missouri bill drafted in reaction to a drag queen story hours. If an advisory board determines that material is inappropriate, it would be removed, and librarians who refuse to do so would face a Class B misdemeanor, a $500 fine, and up to a year in jail. This is not an isolated event. Berger reports for the Life site in March of this year that members of the Minnesota House have introduced a bill that would cut state funding for libraries hosting drag queen story hours by 100%. Senator Mehta tells you that 39% of these library funding comes from the federal government. That means the other 61% comes from the state level. If 21 state governments are completely controlled by Republicans that are pushing forward measures to cut off library funding for this very reason, we have no choice but to fail this legislation. To avoid putting libraries in a double bind, they either adhere to state standards or listen to us. Either way, they lose their funding. I talked about 21 states. Let's move on to the other 39. By forcing libraries to neither restrict nor censor programs, we inhibit them and make them adhere to additional costs, because nowhere in this piece of legislation do we increase our funding to account for it. California proves this very precedent, the very state that Senator Mehta is from. An October Freedom of Information request found that the town of Chula Vista, California, paid $42,000 in police protection in order to have a drag queen story hour due to its extreme unpopularity with citizens. In North Carolina, a public library had to pay $48,000 for that very same reason. This is not the problem I have. The problem I have is when the burden falls solely on local communities. Lada Knott, the director of the First Amendment Center at the Freedom Forum Institute, explains that a 1992 Supreme Court case ruling set a precedent that local governments could not charge private organizations for police protection around protecting free speech. Thus, the entire burden of this piece of legislation that are struggling to stay open. And according to the Pew Research Center, considering
Senator Bendock, I'm going to have to cut you off
of Americans
there.
reported, all right, fail this bill.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was just past the 3 minutes and 15
Yeah, I
seconds.
didn't see you.
And at the
because
end, it
your
started to
screen
lag.
Kind of lagged. Yeah, I didn't see you. I'm
Senator,
sorry.
can we actually have Senator Bendock just say the last 15 seconds because it cut off on my end and I think
Yeah.
it did for the other judges as well. So just
Okay,
the last 15 seconds.
Yeah, my
Yeah, I'm
apologies. Go
sorry.
ahead.
I didn't see you raise anything. All right. And because the Supreme Court ruling set a precedent that local governments could not charge private organizations for police protection, the entire burden falls on libraries that are already struggling. Understand that free speech is intrinsically valuable, but so are libraries staying open. For that reason, please fail this bill.
All right, and with that, we'll move into 2-minute question period. I'm so sorry, Mr. Bendock. I didn't know who
No,
was
no
affected by the
problem.
lag.
Yeah.
All right, we'll start with Ms. Smith. You can go ahead, Ms. Smith.
Thank you. So Senator, talking about specifically funding for this piece of legislation, do you think that it's feasible for libraries to reach that 7% mark?
Yeah.
So if it is feasible, and we've already established that it's going to increase education, both sexually and about sexual orientation, why wouldn't we pass this piece of legislation?
Great question. I'm talking about the libraries in Republican states that are going to bar them from getting to that 7%
But
in the
all
first
other
place.
legislation is null and void once we pass this legislation.
Not state legislation, federal legislation. We're the Congress of the United States. We can't just
Yeah,
censor
but
all
federal
states from
Congress
conducting their
reserves the right to
duties.
have the supremacy clause within the Constitution, which overwrites certain levels of state.
So you're saying we're going to take away all of
Senator
states,
Farage?
Going off of
Senator
that
Farage?
same line, yes, going off of that same line of reasoning, wouldn't that Missouri law become null after we pass this legislation because of the Section 5 stipulations?
Okay, let's say that it does. I
Yeah.
think that's an overreach on states' rights because once we do so, we
Okay.
set a precedent that
But it
whenever we
would
don't like
work,
what
right?
states do, we can.
So this legislation would then work, right?
I don't think so. I think
Why not?
this Section 5 says all laws in conflict with this legislation
that's
are
a
null and
state
void.
law that's
That
in
is
conflict.
federal
Why is it
laws.
not
It doesn't say
nullified?
state laws. They're different things.
Okay, but why does that still not apply? Like, I don't
It
understand.
doesn't.
Mr. Javeri? Senator
I
Javeri?
didn't mean to have my hand up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Senator Mehta.
Hey, so on
Hi.
average, across different libraries in the states, do most libraries receive their funding from federal or state sources?
State sources.
No, it's actually federal sources, like across the board for the most amount of like libraries.
Even
That's
you
just
said in your
federal.
speech that 39% of funding
Yeah,
comes
because
from the
it's
federal
not-
level, which is
because
less than
it-
50%.
Right, because state and federal combined don't make up 100% because there's also outside grants that need to be taken
Like
into
what?
account. Like literally outside donors, they donate to libraries. But my question to you is if states get the majority
Senator
of their
Vyas?
funding from federal
Thank
libraries.
you. If we shouldn't cut funding, if in order to punish libraries or states for banning books, like if we shouldn't cut funding, what else should we do?
That's a great question. First, it's not my burden to prove that I have a whole other plan, but I'll provide you with one anyway. I think the
Okay.
digital world is a great place to promote this education. Let's do that instead of putting libraries in a double bind.
But that doesn't really answer my question. How do we hold states accountable for banning books if we shouldn't touch their funding?
Because we shouldn't cut off all their funding. We can threaten to cut off parts of it, but by shutting them down entirely, that eliminates affirmative advocacy.
And with that, the question time has elapsed. Just to clarify, are you guys able to see me when I'm doing the hand gestures for like the question time? No? Oh, okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure you guys knew how the questioning was going. All right, so we'll just move right into the next affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers, please put your hand up in the chat. I'll give you guys a second to set up. All right, that will go to Senator Bokill.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Bokill, spelled B-O-K-I-L for the judges. Just please let me know whenever you're ready and I'll begin. Thank you. Everyone's good? Okay. And can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Writers are the foundation to our society. They indulge our mind into another world. They spark intellectual ideology and they allow for progression in society. So when there's legislation that halts the progress of a writer, that hurts the foundation of our society, I want to be the first to defend them. Stand with me and affirm today's piece of legislation to save the writers. The first reason why you're going to stand with me and affirm is because this bill addresses economic and social disadvantages faced by authors today. And that's because it reduces restrictions on their creative process. Smithsonian Magazine explains on November 4th of 2019 that the majority of small authors' revenue is usually swallowed up by publishers and manufacturers. And authors are only able to access publishing companies if they're able to sell their books. The problem is, in the status quo, the American Library Association current restrictions are almost entirely up to the interpretation of the public district of the library, as explained by Section 6. And the Journal for American Literary Progress in March of 2020 explains that this is an issue. In some districts across southern Montana, a book featuring anything from a kiss shared between the same gender to blood being portrayed in a gruesome manner is completely restricted. Why is this important? Authors then become less discouraged or simply aren't able to sell their books because they don't seem appealing to publishing companies. And oftentimes this ends their career. The creative process has become extremely limited to less progressive issues, AKA like bringing structural violence at its core. Now, Jane Perito in her book explains in the creative process where she says pertinent societal issues like sexual identity are censored in the educational sphere, then they're also going to be discouraged in policy, censored in the workforce, and censored in society as a whole. Understand that when libraries are censored, this is the building block to all of society as a whole and is impacting our policy as well. As a Congress that prides itself in progress, we've fallen behind on the fight for equal rights. Representative Bendock, it's not the libraries that are going to shut down. It doesn't make sense for states to suddenly say like their content is inappropriate when we pass this legislation saying restrictions aren't allowed. Instead, it's the authors that are going to lose their jobs. But second, you stand with me and you pass because the bill addresses higher education censorship. In the status quo, college library databases censor controversial articles. The American Bar Association explains in June 13th of 2019 that a majority of student-based research for classes or extracurriculars happen through college databases. But by controlling what students see and don't see, colleges are able to bring in their own political opinions and influence and sway the student opinion, forming bubbles of miseducation. Houston Chronicle in January of 2017 said Texas A&M, a school in my home state, was able to promote anti-LGBTQ viewpoints by censoring programs promoting this ideology. Revitalizing library databases allows us to increase and prioritize open education. Save the authors, spread education, change society. Pass.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 13 seconds. All questioners, please raise your hands. I'll first go to Senator Khan.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Okay, guys, just make sure you guys are staying on top of the hand thing because that's what I'm basing it off of. Senator Hurley.
Hi, Senator. Great speech. So can you give me a specific example of a publishing company shutting down a book solely on the basis of regional restrictions on what can be put in the content?
Okay, so I can't give you an example of a certain publishing company. I can tell you that across southern Montana, that's a region where a lot of publishing companies usually do this. And it's because there is censoring in libraries, right? And so depending on our policy with libraries, publishing companies are going to make their decision.
But how is southern Montana reflective of the country at large, considering how small of a portion of the population it has?
I mean, that it's happening in the country.
Senator Javeri.
Thank you. Hi, Ms. Bokill. So what happens when you have institutions or private donors who are giving grants to various institutions because they are of that, let's say, law, like a law institution? What happens when you have people who are giving donations specifically for that purpose, and now you're completely erasing that by making diversity and including all these books into?
I don't think people are giving donations to libraries for being restrictive on content, right? Like, I think when you donate to a library, you want to spread education. And
obviously, but obviously, like a law school would get specific grants from people who are
sure. That's not going to change. Like, we're just making it more open.
With that, the question time has elapsed. We'll now move into a negation speaker. All negation speakers, please just raise your hand in the participants part. That'll go to Ms. Wang.
I thank the chair for my judges. That's Wang, spelled W-A-N-G. Any indication, and I'll begin. Perfect. Great. In the game of Jenga, every move is thought out and calculated, but one piece makes the difference between a standing tower and a jumbled mess. In today's legislation, Section 2C is the difference between censorship and rejection. First, look to the negatives of age-based parental censorship. Libraries preview books before choosing to purchase copies. The school library journal explains that some libraries specifically implemented an honor system that allows library patrons to borrow books about sensitive topics. It is an effort to give patrons a chance to read books about sensitive topics without fear, embarrassment, or parental reprisal. In reality, because of Section 2C of today's legislation, requiring parental consent would only encourage kids to search for the same content online, which is a lot more unpredictable compared to the books that libraries have reviewed. Senator Bokill champions the idea that books about topics like gender, sexuality, and family planning should be accessible to all library patrons. But that is the exact reason why parent permission is not necessary. Requiring parental consent gives parents an opportunity to prevent exposure to social messages that affirmative speakers say are so beneficial. Saying that this information should be accessible to 13-year-olds but not 12-year-olds is censorship based solely on age. Being discouraged to read about certain topics early on leads to decreased trust and does not promote open-mindedness. Furthermore, this legislation limits kids' abilities to use any library resources. Obtaining parental consent is an issue for children in low-income neighborhoods. The Los Angeles Times reports that librarians are noticing increasing numbers of unsupervised children of elementary school age and younger who spend long hours at the library to avoid conditions at home. It is better that these kids are spending time in libraries instead of out on the streets. But this scenario changes when they're constantly asked for their parents' permission to be able to participate in these library activities. In the very first questioning period, Senator Mehta agrees to the importance of establishing a relationship between libraries and children. But that is exactly what Section 2C prevents. Children who don't have parental consent won't be able to participate in the Cops and Kids social program that you agree is so beneficial, Senator Mehta. For some communities, it is an unavoidable issue if the parents are working late and unable to afford childcare. It especially happens during the summer, where some libraries provide free lunch for those who would normally eat meals at school. Crime rates are especially high during the summer when kids in low-income neighborhoods have nowhere else to go. The library serves as a public location, but requiring parent permission for all library activities would discourage these kids from going to the library at all. The affirmative fantasy is no basis for sound public policy. At the end of the day, Section 2C of today's legislation is the Jenga piece that counts.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. Questioners? That'll first go to Senator Bokill.
Okay, so Section 2C says that someone who's younger than 12 has to get parental consent for programs and actually checking out books. But if a lot of these kids are using the library as an escape, what's stopping them from going into the library and just hanging out there in order to escape their homework?
Here's the thing. This legislation makes it very open and vague. It says that it's not only limited to checking out books, but also other library activities. So when you're a kid going into a library and you're constantly asked for parental permission, eventually you're going to be discouraged from going there at all.
Going to happen? Like, can we stop?
Yes, it's going to happen because of Section 2C.
Senator Mehta?
Now, are blanket regulations better or worse than a parental consent clause?
I would say that even like just by requiring parental consent, I mean, you agreed in the first question period to all the benefits.
I mean, it was like a yes or no question. Like, are they better? Right now, if libraries don't even have access to the material, if giving them access to the material is that better than a parental consent?
The Section 2C isn't limited to just the material that you talk about, like sexual orientation or female planning.
It's for students under 12 years
any
of age.
material, any participation required
right now. Does it make sense?
And with that, the question time has elapsed.
I thank the chair.
Now in line for an affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers, please raise your hand. That will go to Senator Khan.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Representative Senator Khan speaking for the first time this legislative session. Can I just get a signal whenever my judges are ready? Thank you. Thank you. SP already? Awesome. On page 30 of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, you'll find one of the book's many themes, spoken by Atticus Finch. You never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view. The empathy of an American classic is the guiding factor that I ask this Congress to use in making a decision on today's legislation. Don't limit those who have already been severely restricted. Pass. First, let's contextualize this debate, something that no speaker thus far has done. Understand that in the status quo, libraries face a catch-22. They can adhere to parents' wishes, or they can create a space of accessibility for children. But passing gives us the best of both worlds. Jonathan Bullington, writing for the Chicago Tribune on August 24th of 2013, explains that libraries have encountered objections from parents concerned with what children bring home. But libraries oversee a storehouse of knowledge where access to information should be expected, not denied. The library can't know what family values are and can't restrict access based on disapproval of content. So instead, they do what they can to match usage and materials and to give parents all the information they need to make good decisions in light of their family values. Senator Wayne tells us that parental permission blocks children from accessing materials, but I have two responses. First, it only applies to children under the age of 12. And secondly, it's important that libraries seek parental permission for those younger children in order to respect those parental rights. But that's a problem that's solved when you pass Section 1, because Section 1 prohibits libraries from censoring and restricting content, but Section 2 mandates that children under 12 years old have to have parental permission. Library content isn't going to be censored, but we still allow parents to decide what children can access, and that's the first reason you affirm. If knowledge is power, then passing empowers the children across America. The impacts of restriction aren't just hypothetical, because when libraries restrict access, they violate intellectual freedoms, as qualified by the American Library Association on December 20th. It isn't acceptable to violate the freedom of the interest of children who go to libraries, and it isn't acceptable either to violate intellectual freedoms. The indifference of the negation won't help children, but passing will. So while Senator Bendock claims libraries are going to close because states won't allow them, first, this legislation doesn't mandate libraries to hold those programs, and secondly, the Library Bill of Rights still prevents the attempts to restrict access to library materials from states or municipalities. But secondly, pass this legislation because it improves civic engagement. The International Federation of Library Associations writes that children's libraries equip children with lifelong learning and literacy skills, because children's libraries have a special responsibility to support the process of learning to read and to give children access to all media. They empower children and advocate for their freedom and safety, encouraging children to become confident and competent people. This Congress, more than anyone, should appreciate the civic engagement of a well-informed public. We serve the Americans who voted us into office, and it's high time we pledge our votes to create a future constituency that is well-informed. Today's debate is going to be one that revolves around promoting equal opportunity and accessibility of information. It passed this legislation so that the motto of our libraries never becomes all content is equal, but some are more equal than others. Affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. All questioners? I'll first go to Senator Bendock.
Thank you, great speech. So if libraries have to pay for the protection of speakers who are maybe controversial, how is this Congress going to equip them with the money to do so?
Right, so that's why you should turn to Representative Maida told you in cross-examination. First, federal funding and other donations to libraries can still manage to help them keep afloat.
Right. Okay, let's take you at your highest ground and assume that's true. If they have to incur additional costs because of these speakers, how are they supposed to pay for it if nowhere in this bill increases their funding?
It doesn't say that they necessarily have to pay the speakers in the first place. It's about protecting programs.
Senator Zhao.
Hi, Senator. So let's talk about the freedom of speech real quick, okay? So
Sure.
You agree that the freedom of speech is important, right?
Absolutely.
But doesn't that also mean that the freedom from speech is equally as important?
Correct. That's why this legislation doesn't mandate that libraries have to do specific programs. It just allows them to host them.
No, but it restricts certain programs, right? Or it no longer lets them restrict certain programs. So that takes away their freedom from speech, doesn't it?
Okay, again, the people who are hosting these programs don't necessarily have to host them. It's their choice to host it, and if they choose to, the library has to let them.
But they're still taking away that
Thank
freedom.
you.
No,
The
it's
speaker may mute himself. Now we'll be moving to the next negation speech. All negative speakers, please raise your hands in the chat. I'll go to Representative Zhou.
Just for clarification, me, right? Because Joe and Joel sound similar.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good.
It is pronounced Joe, right?
Yeah. Sorry, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Senator Joe speaking for the first time. I'm always at the leisure of those above me, so thumbs up when you guys are ready. All right. I've always been a fan of Stephen King's novel, It. He describes that a librarian is to be as close as any human being can to sitting in the peak seat of eternity's engine. Today's legislation shares another mutual value of libraries with it. But there's a similarity between Pennywise and today's legislation. Today's legislation should strike fear into the constituency just as Pennywise does. And that's because, firstly, today's legislation conflates the idea of free access to information to socioeconomic status. Let's begin by talking about Senator Bokel's point about economic and social restrictions on authors. Yes, there are economic and social restrictions on authors that today's legislation fixes, but it doesn't address the economic restrictions on the patrons. And that's problematic because currently in underserved regions, libraries have such limited resources that they have to begin to restrict who gets access to their resources as a punishment to get those who can't afford it to pay back their fees. The New York Times at September 8th, 2018 tells us that libraries are already starved for resources. In some cities, even affluent ones like Atlanta, entire branches are being shut down. But then they tell us that in San Jose, the public library budget is so tight that that users with overdue fees above $20 aren't allowed to borrow books or use computers. Senator Mehta during questioning tells us that libraries are underfunded. Yes, not only are libraries underfunded, but it causes problems with access to information. But this is problematic because if we're accomplishing the goal of removing censorship and providing access, then this access is only truly available to those who can afford it. When we see that libraries are underfunded in the status quo and have to begin to gatekeep access to free information, that's problematic. Even if we do remove censorship under today's legislation, there becomes a socioeconomic gap between who benefits from a lack of censorship. The health education impact that Senator Mehta champions under affirmation will only be available to the ones that can afford to pay their overdue fees. But then Senator Khan champions that we end a catch-22. But affirming today's legislation puts all libraries into another catch-22, one of choice that has more consequences. So right now, libraries will either have to face the choice of either caving into parents' demands or shutting down completely under today's legislation. That's because right now, controversial events have grown in popularity, such as Drag Queen Story Hour. The Washington Post in 2019 tells us that even though the books involving LGBTQ issues represent less than 5% of the books, they've captured the most attention and prompted a heated discussion in the district. Angry parents have spoken out about sexually explicit novels. Essentially what happens is that parents spread flyers online and in person, urging others to stop and boycott the library because it has information that they don't want their children to have access to. But that's a problem because that means that libraries are losing patrons due to their events. But removing them in order to gain back the support of the community and its business is impossible because today's legislation strips them of federal funding if they remove access in general. So we run into a catch-22. Either parents restrict their children from going and libraries lose their patrons because they can't remove the unpopular programs and risk federal funding, or libraries attempt to regain their patrons by removing the unpopular funding and they lose their federal funding, which Senator Mehta has told us is so important. When I was young, I would read horror stories from the library. But when today's legislation turns the library into the horror story, we negate.
Thank you for that speech of exactly 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, go ahead. All right, we'll start with Senator Joel.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have my hand up.
Okay.
That's on me.
Then that's fine. Just make sure you guys remove it afterwards. We'll go with Senator Smith.
Thank you. So where in this legislation does it specifically say that the libraries have to be brick and mortar?
So the libraries, just in general, when we talk about libraries, I mean like their physical location in the community.
Okay, but under this legislation, could it also apply to online courses, online different things that are provided by a library and a database?
Of course.
Okay, so if we're talking about that with a wider definition of library, then how is it any fault of a library to have restricted information, especially since they could be providing factual information for people over the age of 12?
Information based on whether or not you can pay overdue fees. That's regressive.
Senator.
Hi, so how do we know that libraries are going to lose patrons for sure? Like, do we have anything other than that's a hypothesis that that's going to happen?
So I can provide an example. If a library wants to continue providing drag queen story time because this legislation states that they can't restrict that type of programming, then parents will no longer allow their children to go.
Right, I understand, but do we actually have proof backing it up that libraries are going to lose so many patrons that they're going to run out of money?
But they inherently lose their goal of educating the public if they no longer.
They could lose a few patrons, but why are they going to lose so many that they're going to go out of business?
Patrons. When there's such a homogeneity in terms of the beliefs, it becomes all of them.
With that, the questioning time has elapsed. We're now moving to an affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers. That will first go to Senator Farage.
I thank the chair for the judge's reference. This is Senator Farage. It's spelled F-A-R-A-J. And I just need some indication when you're ready. And please hold it up because I'm scrolling through. All right, I see 3 and the parliamentarian. Thank you all so much. I'm also using my phone to time personally, just letting you know. As the US Congress, it often feels like we have the power to change anything. And for the most part, we do. But there's one thing that not even we have the power to change. That's our history. But because of that, we've often tried to hide it. It's because a world in which there is transparency about our history is a world which empowers youth to change the future that we have to affirm today's legislation. Realize that right now, the libraries are the ones who are deciding the media that children are exposed to. And Senator Bendock believes that this legislation can't be effective because states are just going to continue that practice. But here's the thing, state laws are absolutely nullified under today's legislation. That impact doesn't come into fruition. And libraries cannot be punished for promoting diversity after we pass this legislation. Today, we actually empower parents to decide what is most appropriate for their children. And now Senator Wang seems to think that this is a bad thing, but realize that in doing so, we are still functionally creating more diversity and more inclusive communities, beginning from youth. In fact, Carolyn Carson of the University of Kansas explains in her 2018 report that in addition to giving children the opportunity to see themselves in controversial literature, others can learn from reading these types of texts and develop an understanding of the diversity that exists both in their communities and throughout the entire world. Our youth look around them and they see a world of diversity. But when they take a look at the library shelf, that image of America as a place full of people from unique backgrounds is utterly thwarted. Senator Wang, this legislation may require permission for activities, but it doesn't stop children from reading inside the library. And even if parents are limiting, for some children, it still encourages more children to seek out that controversial literature. Passing this legislation finally ensures that the next time they visit that library shelf, it is actually reflective of the country they live in. But next, Senator Zhou is worried about funding from patrons. Here's the thing, there is no guarantee in the first place that these patrons are going to leave. They see that there is a benefit to having more diversity and they're actually going to be able to stay. But furthermore, if we're actually concerned about funding, we can increase that in future. That concern is non-unique. But what is unique is the protection that is provided under this legislation, and specifically for the LGBTQ+ community. That's because in 2016, 5 of the top 10 most challenged books according to the ALA included LGBTQ+ content. And in 2017, that number was 4. But in 2018, that number rose again to 6 out of the top 11 most challenged books. These books might contain content that is considered mature and not always politically correct. But American history was never politically correct either. It's time that we protect our most vulnerable constituents, stop ignoring the past, and focus on improving the future past this legislation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. All questioners. That'll first go to Senator Alex Judd.
Hi, Senator Farage. So in areas with deeply homogenous political beliefs, will constituents be a fan of their library providing something other than that?
No, but here's the thing. We need that kind of diversity, at least in exposure. I actually agree with your concern, and I see that same concern stands for those communities. But if it's such a big one, we can just increase the funding for them.
No, but my question mainly lies with like what happens when people with religious beliefs or like strongly held beliefs
Proposes more religious beliefs and more diversity.
Okay.
We'll just stop for just a moment.
Yeah.
Senator Farage, there seems to be a lag on your microphones, and do you think you could just turn off and turn back on your microphone?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
That sounds better. Can you do it one more time?
Let me disconnect my mic and then I'll plug it back in.
Okay.
Can you all hear me now?
That is much better. I
Awesome.
think that maybe it was not plugged in all the way or something. So
yeah, I have an adapter for my laptop, so that might be it.
Okay, just keep an eye on it because it made you sound a little bit like a robot. We'll continue.
I hope it was a good robot.
Do you want to repeat that question period or continue onwards?
It's up to the questioner.
I was able to hear her fine, so I think you can just move on.
Judges, were you able to understand the questioning block? Okay, let's continue.
I apologize. My
Okay.
internet can lag out sometimes.
No worries, no worries. All right, so we'll just move in with, we'll go with Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. Why is your standard different for 12-year-olds compared to 13-year-olds?
Because 12-year-olds often can't be exposed to the same type of content. And the thing that I was trying to get to in my speech, sorry?
13-year-olds can too, right? Why that difference in age?
Because specifically 13-year-olds in a lot of states are granted more rights than 12-year-olds. It's the reason why we have like PG-13 ratings as opposed to just PG ratings.
If children are fearful of their parents' reaction to the topic of their book they want to check out, are they going to
read it inside the library?
With that, the question time has elapsed. All negative speakers, please raise your hands. And those of you who are not speaking on the neg, just please remove your hand from the participant thing. Senator Javeri, are you not able to put your hand up or you're just raising your placard?
Oh, I mean, I put my hand up on the thing as well, but.
Oh, okay. I was just making sure that no one was being missed. All right. With that, we'll go with Senator Hurley.
Hello, everyone. This is Senator Hurley. For the first time this session, if my judges could just give me some sign of life to let me know they're good to go, we'll get rolling. Hurley. One question that really hasn't been fundamentally addressed throughout this debate is what Congress's primary duty with regards to our children is. Senator Wang briefly mentioned earlier that we are pulling back some programs for them, but I believe we have to more fundamentally address the fact that this could have a negative impact on their health. Senator Metro, you mentioned that you want libraries to be open and available for everyone and their programming to be fair and equal. But the issue is that even if we assume Senator Bendock's argument that this entire bill would fail just because it is not enforceable, that point of view isn't accurate because you fail to see how many children are losing access to the fundamental resources made available by these libraries. First and foremost, let's discuss fundamentally how that's going to happen. Senator Wang briefly touched on Section 2, subsection C of this legislation's ability to directly limit the ability of children under the age of 12 to have regular access to libraries. She discussed the broad idea of censorship and gave some limited notes on how programming was a missing major part, but she didn't really delve into the overall implications for low-income Americans. For most low-income Americans, there's the issue of their parents aren't regularly available to offer this consent. The Urban Institute explains that because low-income parents have to work more hours to be able to make enough money to provide for their families, they are very rarely available during the same time periods that public libraries are open. Because these parents are working longer hours, they're not able to give their children this consent regardless of what's occurring. Senator Metro and Senator Khan, this legislation is going to limit kids' access to great opportunities, and these institutions offer simply because of arbitrary reasons. Several negs have mentioned the broad scope implications, but let's get specific. Morgan M. Philbin from the Department of Socioeconomic Sciences at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health tells us that the United States has some of the largest health disparities in the world as it pertains to young people. Life expectancy varies up to almost 20 years between some counties. Public libraries are well positioned to address this stark disparity from a young age. Certified health education specialist Laura A. Lindman highlights how studies have shown that patrons often have access to direct health information. We're going to give our kids access to direct information on how to better their health and to better nutritional standards. Legislation, you want them to lose out on that. Furthermore, let's talk about how this legislation is going to combat food insecurity. Isn't going to combat food insecurity. The Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion contextualizes that as of 2016, 31.6% of low-income Americans were food insecure, compared to the general population, which was about 12.3%. Senator Wang touched on the security idea, but didn't delve more deeply into it. According to the Journal of Extensions, public libraries host a variety of activities aimed at improving nutrition and providing direct food to children. These include classes that teach young people how to prepare food on their own and how to be self-sustainable later in life, on top of the fact that it helps prevent obesity epidemics among low-income communities. This legislation rips that opportunity away from children, and that's simply unacceptable. I want our kids to have access to food and to healthy lifestyles, and I won't pass a bill that limits that.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners? That will first go to Senator Tang.
Sorry, I had
Senator
my
Tang, I think you're in mute. Yeah. Oh, okay. So you, okay. Okay, and then we'll just move on to Senator Villas.
All right. So is library funding in the status quo like a zero-sum game? It either goes to gender issues or it goes to food issues, right?
I don't see how that's in any way pertinent to the argument I just made.
Right, but you said that if we pass today's legislation, like funding is ripped away from like food programs, right?
No, I said the ability of children to get involved with food programs.
Right. Why is that so? And like, why is like gender
the ability of
issues?
children under the age of 12 to partake in these programs because of low-income families being unable to provide regular consent.
Right, but on net, if libraries
Senator Farage.
Going off of that same line of reasoning, are food classes controversial?
No, the issue isn't controversy here, Senator.
Yeah.
It's about parents aren't available during the same
Okay,
regular
can I finish my question?
open to provide that consent.
Yeah, can I finish my question?
Sure.
If they're not controversial, why do they require consent?
The legislation doesn't stipulate that. It says all library-related programs.
No, but it means the ones that access diversity. Why do they require consent for these specific food programs?
Again, it limits all abilities, such as internet access.
I don't see where it says that. Can you show me where it stipulates that?
Just a moment.
With that, the questioning has elapsed.
Section 2, subsection C.
The questioning has lapsed. It's fine, no worries. All right, so we'll move into the next affirmative speech. I'll just remind Senator Villas and Farage to just remove their hands, unless you're speaking for the next side. Senator Hurley, do you have a motion?
Point of personal privilege. Exit chamber.
State that privilege. Granted. Next time you can just do the clapping hands thing like we did last time. Okay. So it's based off of those standing, Senator Smith, you have the floor unopposed.
I thank the chair. Based off of how I have to have my computer, I cannot actually see PO, parley, or judges at this time. So I'm just going to take a couple seconds, make sure that you have your stuff together so that my connection is not faltering. All right. And then if it's okay with the PO, I'd like to begin. Perfect. Since the coronavirus epidemic, I've been seeing some serious changes in the world. So one of the ones that you should be concerned of under this piece of legislation is that brick and mortar libraries are more and more commonly becoming on the internet and having online courses. According to the ALSC, a division of the American Library Association, on April 3rd, 2020, there has been the largest increase of online courses, online resources, and information published through databases on certain websites from libraries within different regions of the US than there has been at any increase in the US so far. Now, this is a huge piece of information because thus far in the debate, we have not been considering online as well as brick and mortar availability. And I'm going to go through the neg and affirmation arguments and explain how, with this in mind, we must pass today's legislation. So first, in the first speech of this debate, and then later extended by Senator Farage, Senator Mehra talked about the targeted public health issues within libraries and how this is going to increase information on sexual orientation, sexual health. Now, Senator Wang, you had the concern that 12 years old is too young for that amount of information. But according to the CDC, in an article published on January 4th, 2016, the average age of reproduction within the United States is 12.5 years old, meaning that at that point, that is one of the earliest points that males and females both are going to start to have to learn more information about their sexual health, reproductive health, and sexual orientations. That 12-year-old standard is made so that they have the ability to go seek out that information when they need it by themselves. Also, I'd like to further this idea that parents can't provide consent for their children under 12 years old, especially with the speech that Senator Hurley just said, and in regards to what Senator Wang was previously stating. So within the United States currently, a parent or legal guardian 18 years of older must apply for a library card for a child under 14 years old. 12-year-olds are under 14 years old. So that means that the child and parent must be present in order for the child to have a library card and have library access. So with this legislation, we're not changing anything. We're actually making it easier for our constituents and their children to be able to access libraries, lowering the age of parental consent, something that no one else has brought up yet on the flow. Also, Senator Mehra, I would really like to extend your arguments talking about the sexual health and sexual orientation, because currently within the United States, an issue that's not talked about enough, 10 states and DC require inclusive content with regard to sexual orientation. Only 10 out of 51. 7 states require that only negative information to be provided on homosexuality and or positive emphasis on heterosexuality. We are not providing information that is unbiased to our constituents and their children. When we pass today's legislation, when we help lower the age of consent so that they have the ability to seek out the information that they need for their sexual health, their reproductive health, and their right under the Bill of Rights provided to them by our US Constitution, we are upholding our job as senators and congressmen. We must affirm.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Joel.
Great speech, Senator. So can online libraries accomplish all of the same purposes as brick and mortar libraries?
So while they cannot hold programming, they can provide the same amount of information with audiobooks, textbooks, and some of the information.
What about job assistance? What about like financial literacy, in-person training?
So obviously there's not going to be in-person training, but especially now with
okay, what about help
we're
with mental
ways
health?
to make the other types work.
Librarians are becoming increasingly relied upon for mental health issues. Can online libraries do that as well, or?
Online libraries can give them resources such as the Trevor Act, Suicide Prevention
Senator Hurley.
Hey, Senator. So I want to go off a line of questioning with regards to this library card type deal. Do all library programs require access to a library card?
Under the American Library Association, yes.
You
can go in, but you can't bring any content out without a library card.
But can you participate in programs in those libraries?
You are able to without a library.
I discussed earlier.
Sorry, say that again.
Such as the food programs I mentioned earlier. Can you participate without a library card?
I'm not aware.
The answer is yes. So that restriction, that entire contention is dropped.
But food programming is different than information about sexual health and sexual orientation.
But this legislation is going to impact both.
The questioning time has elapsed. Senator Khan, granted. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation on negation speakers, please raise your hands. I'll go to Senator Tiffany Zhao.
I thank the chair. Hello, this is Senator Zhao, spelled Z-H-A-O, speaking for the first time today. If it's okay with the judges, I'm going to do my speech standing. Just let me know if you have a problem with that. Okay, great. Thank you. As always, a smile or nod or thumbs up from you guys when you're ready. It'd be great. Perfect. And my party's ready. My other judge. Awesome. Okay. As LGBTQ rights advocate Barbara Giddings explains, equality means more than just passing laws. The struggle is really won in the minds and hearts of the community, where it really counts. Unfortunately, the struggle has not been won in the hearts and minds of the community, of all communities across the nation today. And until the struggle is won, these communities will continue to find loopholes in our legislation. And it's because the loopholes in today's legislation have dangerous repercussions. We must fail. First, fail today's legislation because there's a loophole that actually increases anti-LGBTQ and pro-life literature in libraries. And that's because if you take a look at section 1's text, you will see that it does not specifically say that you can't restrict materials promoting sexuality and gender and other topics. It just says that libraries can no longer restrict texts regarding these topics. What that essentially means is that libraries, conservative libraries, can realize this loophole and instead use anti-LGBTQ literature to fulfill the 7% requirement established in section 2. So, and as Slate magazine explains in February, anti-LGBTQ literature is already prominent in many libraries. According to a quick search of the New York Public Library's collections, anti-LGBTQ literature is not censored and does in fact exist in many libraries across the nation right now. Representatives, it is extremely detrimental and dangerous to increase exposure to anti-LGBTQ sentiment. And that's because it fuels detrimental behaviors and negative attitudes. The CDC reports that these negative attitudes will actually increase LGBTQ people's chance of experiencing violence, especially compared with other students in their schools. Violence can include behaviors such as bullying, teasing, harassment, physical assault, and suicide-related behaviors. But what's worse, increasing the exposure to anti-LGBTQ literature is going to intensify parents' rejections of their own children, because unlike what Senator Farage might say, parents are not always the good guys. A study published in 2009 compared gay, lesbian, and bisexual young adults who experienced strong rejection from their families with their peers who had more supportive families. The researchers found that those who experienced stronger rejection were 8 times more likely to have tried to commit suicide, 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, 3 times more likely to use illegal drugs, and 3 times more likely to have risky sex. So passing today's legislation is not going to restrict the amounts, is not actually going to get rid of the restriction of open and pro-LGBTQ literature, but is actually going to increase the amount of anti-LGBTQ literature. So Senator Mehta, we are not going to see an increase in sex education literature. Senator Baca, we will not see author sales go up. And Senator Farage, we will not see literature on diversity increase at all if we pass today's legislation. But second, fail today's legislation because even if libraries do not realize this loophole, this legislation still disproportionately hurts rural communities. And that's because rural communities tend to be the most conservative and will not most likely not comply to today's legislation and receive the federal funds punishments outlined in section 3. Because as Governing Magazine reports in July 2016, there are 15 states where rural residents make up more than half the populations. Republicans are governors of 11 of them. So we need to fail today's legislation in order to actually be in support of the LGBTQ community. Thank you.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. It just lagged out for me a little bit there, so I just wanted to give you some extra time. I don't know if that was the same issue for everybody else.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
No problem. We'll first go with Senator Boco.
Okay, so regarding means like concerning a certain like topic, right? So I'm confused on how people are going to circumvent that if we're basically saying if this book talks about this, you have to not restrict it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So regarding just means pertaining to a certain topic, right? So if you're like using literature that is anti-LGBTQ and is against these open gender concepts, that's still regarding these topics. It's still going to be allowed under this definition because it doesn't specify that the literature has to be promoting these ideas.
But then they're also going to have to do promoting LGBTQ topics, right? Like under this legislation, all of
they don't necessarily because there's just a 7%.
Senator Donaldson.
Hi, so in the past year specifically, are municipal libraries self-censoring or are states doing it for them?
You can tell me.
So in a lot of cases, they're having to self-censor. Why is that?
You can tell me.
Well, I'm asking you.
I don't really see how this point pertains to my point. I mean, either way, this definition is not clear enough, and vagary allows for
have to end up self-censoring because they can't get the resources they need. How does this piece of legislation not help solve for that?
It doesn't help solve for that because it's going to just increase anti-LGBT
With that,
literature. I'm sorry.
The questioning period has elapsed. We're now moving to an affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers. That will go to Senator Donaldson.
Hi, everyone. Just before I start, my name is Emily Donaldson. I'm speaking for the first time this legislative session. Can everyone hear me before we start?
Yes.
Pretty clearly. Awesome. That's great. Is everyone good? Okay. Questioning authority should be a value that we actively practice in our democracy instead of a slogan that we absently stand by. Whether it's questioning the content in our books or the bills that we pass as a Senate, it is fundamentally important that we keep the lens of accountability as the focus in this round. This piece of legislation creates the crux of that and allows us to take accountability further than we've ever had before in educational policy. That is fundamentally democratic. That's what you stand for by passing today's piece of legislation. First, let's break down the debate because both affirmative and negative senators want to protect book and media topics outlined in Section 1 of today's bill. However, our main disagreement is under the implementation, or Section 3 of today's piece of legislation, on how we want to hold states accountable. So far, Senator Mehta has told us that we're able to bridge rural and urban gaps, but hasn't really told us why. But Senator Bendock says that we can't because of low funding for libraries. Let me solve both of these concerns by saying today's piece of legislation allows municipal libraries to stop being scapegoats for unjust state policies. Here's why. The American Library Association in September of 2019 partnered with the University of Alabama College Education Program explains that states craft policies that force municipal libraries to self-censor themselves. Let me explain. In the last banned books week just last year, publishing companies were pushed by states to revise their contracts with public libraries. Instead of having a one-time purchase of books, and specifically ebooks, public libraries now had to pay had to abide by 2-year contracts where they had to repurchase any and all books they had at a higher rate every single time the contract elapsed. This is a huge problem because states specifically direct the pricing for banned books to be on average $20 higher than the average ebook. This is a huge issue because states use publishers to get at local library municipalities. But today's piece of legislation changes that. The Institute for the Museum and Library Services provided under Section 3 of today's legislation, that director has an intertwined relationship with municipal libraries, meaning that they're able to understand, one, the capacity of the library, how many books they're taking out on a daily basis, and two, how much they're paying for all of these books. They can spot the financial discrepancies that us as a Congress are not right now. Senator Bokel, she explains that publishers are shutting down. That is why books are not getting to us. That's not true. States are overpricing books that they want to censor. Today's Congress takes that power out of states' hands by creating a clear divide between municipal library policies and the states that are trying to manhandle them. Senator Khan brings up an argument in today's round about civic engagement being the most important part of libraries. I completely agree. Whether it's voting rights for adults or job finding services, our libraries are large and expansive. We must protect them by passing.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. All questioners? Is that everybody? There we go. We'll go with Senator Zhou.
All right, hi. So when libraries self-censor themselves in the status quo, does parental pressure also play a factor in that?
Not very much anymore, because the issue is that like parents can say that they don't like a book, but the problem is that libraries have been trying to be more progressive, but states are literally overpricing these books that are banned and that parents don't want. So libraries can't afford them.
So would you say that communities also put the pressure on the library to curate its books to fit a certain religious or political belief?
I'd actually argue that communities are more in favor of civic engagement activities like Senator Zhao mentioned. Hi.
Sorry, my apologies. I made the same mistake.
Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. So Senator, do you want to ask a question?
No, sorry. I thought Representative Donaldson thought that I had a question. I was just going to say that.
Oh, I thought you did as well. My apologies.
Okay.
Sorry. I didn't clarify.
That's all fine. So does Anybody want to take up the remaining block? You still have 30 seconds, and I only see Senator Donaldson's hand up. Senator Bendock, that'll go to you.
Sure. All right. So we're in this piece of legislation to say that the director of institutes of the museum can change the prices of books.
Right, so that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm pointing out that we're able to specifically identify financial discrepancies that exist because the Institute of the Museum can separate the municipal library from the states crafting the policy and see them as two different things.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if we aren't able to identify the discrepancies right now, how are you able to tell us that there's discrepancies?
Because this piece of legislation provides solvency. We know
But what does this change from the status quo?
Can help fix that
Nothing.
state policy.
The questioning time has elapsed.
I thank the chair.
Just as a reminder for everybody, just after you speak or after you've asked a question, just go ahead and put your hand down so we don't face a lot of discrepancies with that. Senator Zhao, that's granted.
Thanks.
We'll now move to a negation speech unless there's any motions on the floor. Any negative speakers? That will go to Senator Tang.
Thank you. That was crazy. I mean, a lightning bolt just fried my router or something for like 2 minutes. Never had that happen before, but I'm back.
I'll just say once you're done with your speech, just go ahead and like change your name so that, because I know you probably just re-entered the meeting, but it's fine. You can worry about it later. Just don't want Tab kicking you out.
All right, just give me a second. All judges ready? Good, good, good. We ready to go. Today, America has more governors who have worn blackface than it has black governors. Among the Forbes 500, there are more CEOs named James than there are CEOs who are women. It makes no sense to wave our magic wand and pretend to care about diversity when our leaders themselves are not diverse. Let me explain how exactly this piece of legislation directly relates to diversity. But before, we need to address two big concerns. The first big concern from the negation is how exactly affirming today's piece of legislation will boost intellectual vitality and help people get more knowledge in general. I have two responses to that. The first response, according to the Cornell Legal Information Institute Access Today, that 66% of library funding comes from the federal government. But here's the problem. As the School Library Journal of October 2018 tells us that 15% of librarians have difficulty finding those diverse titles because they aren't available for purchase. However, when they're forced to find some way to buy them and allocate under Section 2A, this simply isn't possible and decreases funding. The second response I have is that a 2017 survey on state library agency staff reveals that 88.5% of respondents cite a lack of funding. But here's the catch statistic that you need to hear. 42% of the challenges for these books come from the patrons who fund those libraries. Clearly a huge problem. Now let's link all the impacts to how this harms diversity. Under Section 3, if they can't satisfy this, we cut off US Code 20, Chapter 72. However, as the Cornell Legal Information Institute tells us, that Part 4 of that law, the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program, includes $25 million in funding to train and recruit librarians from diverse backgrounds, including people of color. There is no reason to pass this piece of legislation when there are good things in place that we would be removing. The second key contention that the affirmation brings up has to deal with age. However, even though Representative Farage tells us that Section 2C consent creates equality, this is actually not a good thing. Why exactly this is the case? Because as the Pew Hispanic Center tells us in November of 2018, 1.5 million kids in the US are undocumented and can't prove their age because they don't have an ID. We are literally discriminating against certain groups who can't have the ID and find the consent of that singular age. This gets even worse because as the Chapin Hall for Research Center at University of Chicago explains on November of 2017, there are 4.7 million homeless kids in America. Where exactly are they supposed to find an adult to give them consent to enter this library? This piece of legislation is clearly counterintuitive. There's too many parts that harm us and hurt our diversity. Stop waving your magic wand and believing that it's actually going to do something. Focus on the pragmatics and the possibilities. Fail.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 1 second. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Mehta.
Okay, so your side's been pushing this rhetoric from the very beginning. Funding is only taken away if the libraries don't comply, right?
Yeah.
So why would they not comply?
Because some of them literally can't comply.
Why?
Because according to the School Library Journal on October 2018, 15% of librarians have difficulty finding diverse titles which are not available for purchase, and 13% are blocked from purchasing those diverse titles.
It's quite simple. All you need to do is expand access to resources you're restricting right now.
Senator
Right?
Javeri.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Tang. So you would agree with me that right now there are various donors across the United States that provide funds to libraries, right?
Yes.
So let's say these libraries specialize in a certain topic, like let's say they focus on medical, like if there's a library at medical university. What happens to the donor when you increase the amount of literature and knowledge like this legislation is doing? What does the donor do in that situation?
I'm not sure. I don't know what a
Donor would obviously retract their funds because the library is not complying with their policies, right? If a donor is specifically providing money,
increasing this.
The questioning time
yes
has elapsed. The questioning time has elapsed. Everybody, please go ahead and just unhand the participant chat. We'll now be moving on to the next affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers. That will go to Senator Vyas unopposed.
All right, cool. I'm gonna make this for the judges. That's Representative Vyas, VYAS. Any indication when you're ready? One quick thing before I'm ready. Given the patterns of last session, it looks like this will probably be my final speech of the session. It could very well be the tournament and thus my career. Therefore, I just want to give a few quick thank yous. First, to my old captains, Nyan, Andrew, Ella, Samia, to my parents, my brother, Miss Marks, and Brittany, and then finally to Jaffa Kovnick, Emma Sedlak, and Cassandra Berlin. Thank you. It's meant to law. Any indication from the judges when you're ready? Gladly begin. Perfect. Thank you. What does the week of September 27th mean to you? For me, it means the start of Banned Book Week in America. This year, I fully intend on celebrating because the idea that any book or any piece of information can be prevented from getting to our constituents in America scares me. But I am proud to stand in affirmation, to stand for the same values that led us to celebrate banned books rather than continue to ban them. First, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite banned books, 1984, and how the theme of 1984 is prevalent throughout today's debate, but specifically the theme of government overreach. Lots of speakers in the negation have focused on how Section 2C of today's legislation prevents kids from getting information so long as they're under the age of 12. I'd agree. Section 2C of today's legislation is not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but it is absolutely necessary to ensure that we can prevent more books from being banned. You see, the reason Section 2C is in today's legislation is that it provides a check for parents, because in the World Economic Forum reports in September of 2019 that the most common reason books are banned is because it goes against what parents want to teach their children. Without the check in Section 2C, where we would only see more and more parents push for more books to be banned. But by giving a concession in Section 2C, we ensure that books are no longer banned because parents no longer are pushing for more books to be banned if they feel they have control over the children's education. The second book that I'd like to talk about is Catch-22, and it's because the negation has found themselves in a Catch-22 throughout all of today's debate. Senator Zhao has championed the idea that that libraries in the status quo aren't going to comply with today's legislation, but the punishment in today's legislation is a lack of funding. Understand why that's so impactful. First, Everyone from Senator Bendoff to Senator Mehta has argued over the amount of funding that's going to libraries from the federal government. Allow me to clarify. The American Library Association updated this year that the majority of federal library funds are distributed through the federal government. The punishment for not complying with today's legislation is a loss of a majority of funds. If you're a library executive, you would always prefer a world where you can't ban books, but still have a library to run, rather than a world where you can have books, but no library whatsoever. If libraries lose funding in the status quo, they cease to exist. Libraries must follow the stipulations in today's legislation. Fahrenheit 451 tells the story of a world where information is not a right or even a privilege. It is non-existent. To avoid that, vote in the affirmation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Zhao.
Hi, Senator. So let's take your second point at its highest ground. Okay, so let's say that that's completely true and all the funding is fine and all libraries are going to comply and whatnot. How and where did you prove that the affirmative impact somehow outweighs my first contention's impact that we're actually going to be increasing anti-LGBTQ literature under today's legislation because of the vague wording?
I'd say on net, it is always better to have more access to problems or rather issues that, yes, I'd say it is better to have a book on
even if it's fueling negative attitudes
rather than not have the book at all.
Even if it's fueling
I'd always argue access is better than
So
not.
if we affirm today's piece of legislation, are we bringing those banned books from that banned book week back into the system?
We require that libraries in Section 2A have to spend at least some of their funding on increasing access.
So would those books,
even if they don't,
would that like
even if they
include?
don't have access, I'd love to answer your question. Even if they don't have access in the status quo, Section 2A stipulates that they must spend money at least trying to access those books.
With that, the question period has elapsed. Senator Boco, is that a motion?
It's a point of inquiry. So if we want
Say that inquiry.
If we want to do an amendment, should I first send it to you or do I send it to everyone in the chat?
I mean, I don't know if there is an option to send it directly to me, but you can just put it in the chat and then I can just go through it with the parley. I don't think there's an option for you to just send it privately to me.
You should be able to, Senator, if you are in the chat box, you should be able to click participant and then the person's name in the drop down. If you'd like to, do you not have that on your end?
I think for us, we only have Parley and then the co-host.
Oh, okay, stand corrected. Go ahead and just send that in the chat.
Yeah. All right. We'll go right back into a negative speech. On negative speakers, please raise your hands at this time.
Motion.
State that motion.
I move to previous question.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any against? I don't see everybody raising their placards, so it's a little hard for me to tell. Is there any objection to the motion?
Point of inquiry.
Say that inquiry.
When it comes to voting, do we raise our placards or raise our hands?
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, go ahead and raise your hand in the participant thing. So yeah, I'll go call for it again. Those who want to second the motion for moving to the previous question, just put your hands up and I'll give you a minute to get that settled. All right. Any against?
Senator, you called for a second. You didn't ask for all those in favor. So it sounds as though the motion has been seconded. So now you can call for a vote.
Okay, okay. Say the inquiry.
For the presiding officer, I'm not looking at the precedence and recency chart, but are there people who have not yet spoken on today's piece of legislation?
Yeah, I mean,
I haven't spoken yet, and
yeah.
I would prefer actually that if
Senator's decorum.
Or point of inquiry.
Say the inquiry.
Isn't I haven't spoken yet, and I would actually prefer if my first speech is on the next bill.
Okay, so we'll just go back to the vote for the motion to moving to previous question? So all those four. All right, that looks unanimous. I know people are still putting their hands in. So we'll just move right into the motion for the previous question. All those in favor of passing this legislation, just put your hands up. That seems to be 6. 7. All those against? All right, that's 8. That's everybody. So in a vote to 7 to 8, this legislation does in fact fail. Is there a motion, Senator Hurley?
Seeing a natural break in debate, I move for a 5-minute recess.
Any seconds? Parley and judges, would that be okay with you guys?
It's up to the chamber.
Okay, yeah, so we'll just have a, I think that was unanimous. People were putting their hands up late and then everybody went away. So yes, we'll move into a 5-minute recess. Please be back by 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. For the judges in the parley, is everything good in regards to like POing or anything like that? Do you want to see anything changed? Everything's good? Perfect. Thank you guys.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep. We do have a minute left. It is 4:30 where I am, so if everybody could just start turning on their cameras once again, and we'll just get started. Are we still waiting on Senator Smith? Okay, there we go. Great. Now that everyone's back, we'll just go right into the next legislation. Is there a sponsorship present for 2A regarding controversial speakers? Ah, yes. Based off of those standing, that will go to Senator Joe.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Joe speaking for the second and last time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, so any like thumbs up or indication when you guys are ready. All right. Okay. Sounds good. I'd like to carry this chamber through a quick history lesson. For the first president in the inception of our nation, we had one political party, and that president, George Washington, warned us against partisanship. But as time passed, it seems that we didn't listen to him because we continued to build and break political parties, eventually culminating in our current two-party political system. Our two-party system for the past 200 years hasn't taken care of this country, but today's legislation ameliorates the issue in one of the most important places of free thought, college campuses. So let's begin by talking about my legislation today. It creates a task force and threatens federal funding for all colleges that disinvite speakers that are controversial to the general student body. But this is important because a problem in the past has been that disinviting people helps actually create polarized political recruitment. Let's start out by establishing 3 different people on college campuses. Let's say liberals, conservatives, and everyone else in the middle. Every time the liberals protest the conservatives for bringing someone in, the conservatives point to the liberals as prejudiced, and the people in the middle end up siding with them, creating recruitment. But this is done on purpose. Vox with a V on August 3rd of 2018 tells us that the campus free speech crisis is somewhat manufactured. Conservative student groups invite speakers famous for offensive and racially charged speech and a deliberate attempt to provoke the campus left. When students react by protesting or disrupting the event, the conservatives use it as proof that there's real intolerance for conservative ideas. So a lot of the people who are fans of the speakers, who in many cases are more radical than the speakers themselves, become far more prominent members on their campus and do a really good job at recruiting people. But this is bad because a UC Berkeley study in October 28 tells us that when college officials disinvite controversial speakers from campus events, it gets used by both left and right groups to drum up more support for their respective groups, polarizing the campus climate more. And this just leads to more extremism and polarization as more people in the middle eventually get pulled to either end of the political spectrum. And that's a direct result of inviting the controversial speakers and then disinviting them as a result. This causes more riots and protests, which are the very thing that causes colleges to disinvite speakers in the first place. As you guys can see, this is already a cycle that exists in the status quo of college campuses, but passing my legislation today puts a stop to that entire cycle. So now that we know that we end the continuation of polarization, let's see how we actually reverse that trend of campus polarization with affirming my legislation today. That's because we make sure that guest speakers actually speak on these campuses. And that's important in removing political biases. Suzanne Goldberg from the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy tells us that even apart from times of political polarization, debates about society's received wisdom have played an important role in moving ideas from the periphery to the mainstream and in transforming the ways we understand ourselves and our surroundings. My legislation today prevents colleges from disinviting guest speakers, which is important when it stifles open political discussion. But when we have more guest speakers on these campuses, what we see is that we end up actually opening up more political discussion and decreasing the polarization that exists on college campuses. Today, let's honor George Washington's wishes by codifying it into law and affirm today's legislation. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners? That will first go to Senator Smith.
Sorry, thank you. Can we talk about the Section 3B? So any institution found in this task force in non-compliance shall forfeit any direct federal funds it receives. How are higher educational institutions going to be able to stay afloat without any federal funding?
Well, this mainly provides leverage. It's a fairly I would say easy task for college campuses to simply not disinvite controversial speakers.
What
this
if
is a
the
good
controversial speaker is having threats against them from coming to an area? Would that federal funding still be taken away?
No, not necessarily. It's contingent on colleges disinviting.
Senator Joel.
Great speech, Senator. So what branch of government determines whether something is unconstitutional?
The Supreme Court, judicial.
Yeah, so why is this Congress essentially creating its own court to rule on the constitutionality of something?
It's a task force. It's not a court. We can still do
But it can determine and apply the law though, correct?
Yes.
Isn't that a violation of separation of powers?
No, not necessarily, because we're creating a task force that investigates and then takes action. We are allowed to take action as a Congress.
But what
Senator
branch
Khan?
of government determines constitutionality?
Right, so let's talk about that task force. So it's chosen by the Department of Education, the Attorney General, right?
Yes.
Doesn't that effectively just allow the executive branch to appoint whoever it wants and corrupt the vetting process for the task force?
Well, not necessarily, because even if it is done by a specific political party, that doesn't negate the idea that we know when colleges disinvite college speakers. There is no partisanship involved with that.
Right, so then is the sole purpose of the task force like just to Google colleges who've disinvited speakers?
It's to check who disinvites speakers and then enact a proper punishment.
Senator Bias.
All right, so this punishment is pretty harsh, right?
Yes.
Right, so in order to avoid like losing this money, some colleges might not invite these speakers in the first place, right?
Well, it's usually not even the colleges that invite these speakers. It's usually controversial student groups.
Right, but that still is that's still applicable under today's legislation, right?
Well, sure, but I don't think any student groups are.
What I'm getting at is, isn't discourse going to go down if less speakers are coming to college campuses?
I'm saying that the student groups aren't going to be deterred by this because it's the campus.
The question is, how is discourse going to be affected?
Questioning time has elapsed. Next in line for negation speech, all negation speakers, please raise your hands. And for those of you who are not looking for the negation speech, please put your hands down. There we go. Of those standing, that'll go to Senator Wang. Or excuse me, Senator Javeri. I didn't see your thing up.
Point of inquiry.
State that inquiry.
I didn't speak in the previous session, so wouldn't that give me?
I haven't spoken.
I don't think Senator Javeri has not spoken yet either.
Hi everyone, my name is Representative Javeri, Javeri. Fortunately, I wasn't able to speak on the last bill, but this is probably going to be my first and final speech today. So just any indication when you guys are ready, and I'll be happy to begin. Good, and good. Okay. In 2017, popular conservative speaker Milo Yiannopoulos was violently attacked on a UC Berkeley campus. But this protest came with heavy backlash because of his anti-Islamic and anti-feminist views. Because still, even in the 21st century, even on the land of the free, freedom still comes with a cost. So first, fail today's piece of legislation because the task force that we are implementing under this legislation is still going to be heavily politicized. Mr. Zhao in his sponsorship came up here and told you that political partisanship is a very big problem, and I'm pretty sure everyone in this Congress can agree that is a true statement. But I want to go through line by line in this legislation and explain to you how this legislation does not solve the core issue at hand. So first, the committee itself is created to foster First Amendment in a non-partisan way, meaning Democrats and Republicans both get the right to, first of all, have equal free speech on college campuses. But the way the legislation is tailored, it's going to be extremely skewed to one side, as Section 2 appoints 9 people by the Department of Education in the task force and another 9 people by the Attorney General. So let's understand who the Department of Education is going to employ. As the DOA explains, that they are mainly a bipartisan organization, so we can ensure that the 9 people that they employ are going to be relatively bipartisan. But when we take the problem of the Attorney General, or William Barr, we're going to be seeing that the conservative movement is actually going to be much heavily skewed on this side of the task force. As Washington Post explains on December 5th of 2019, that time and time again, the Justice Department under William Barr has taken politicized positions on issues like whistleblower campaigns, to complaints on Congress, and other issues related to the President of the United States, President Trump. So therefore, with a Republican panel from the Justice Department and a bipartisan department from the Department of Education, we're going to be seeing that the tilt is going to be slightly skewed to the conservative side, thus negating what our goal is to make it bipartisan. Because whether you're from the left or whether you're from the right, our goal is to pave a way forward for you. But if this legislation fundamentally cannot do it, it doesn't make sense to approve the legislation. But second, colleges have also been instituting their own policies to protect free speech. Because as the first negation speaker, I want to set the framework that yes, colleges are actively working to better the situation of free speech on campus. As the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education explains, that when the alarm over campus free speech was at its height in 2016, there were over 43 disinvitations recorded on campuses across the United States. But recently, in 2018, that number dropped to only 9, a 34 reduction in the amount of disinvitations. Why? Because colleges, as the Nyaskin Center explains on January 25th of 2019, that the number of institutions with restrictive speech codes are falling to historic lows because college campuses are finally taking action in ensuring that college speech on their campus is free and equal. At the end of the day, it's on this Congress to make sure that the cost of liberty never falls below the cost of repression. And it's because this legislation continues the polarization in the status quo, doesn't change how we're going to adapt our policies, I ask everyone to negate.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Farage.
Hi, Senator. So why is it problematic if someone from the right-leaning side chooses the task force?
So I would say that the ideal goal of the task force is to be nonpartisan. So
Okay, but what does the task force actually do? They just check if a college is actually complying, right?
Yeah, so obviously if you have a conservatively tilted task force, they would like stop other Democrats.
Okay, but it's pretty simple to see if a college is actually like inviting them or disinviting them. Why is bias a big problem?
Yeah, so I told you in my second contention that in 2018 there were only 9 disinvitations, which was a 34.
Senator Donaldson.
Okay, but why?
Increase from.
Hi, so if we fail today's piece of legislation, what do we revert back to decide on these cases?
Like specifically of the disinvitations?
Right, so like if there are these court cases happening, what happens if like we don't have a special panel? What would be the alternative?
So then I would say that the college campuses would gain the right to declare a speaker.
Well, no, it's also just like individual court judges on appellate courts would have individual assessment reviews that
I mean, I guess it would depend on what exactly the
like more polarized than what already exists.
I would say that if the speaker was saying something clearly against
Senator Mehta. Senator Mehta.
Okay, so what exactly is the role of the task force under this legislation?
The task force is just implemented to investigate the First Amendment freedom rights of speech.
Yeah, you're right. Who do they report to?
Who do they report to?
Yeah.
Well, the Department of Education appoints the members. The House Committee of Education oversees.
Yeah, no. They all report to the House Committee on Education, which makes the final version.
Sure.
Is the House Committee bipartisan?
Well, they're overseeing the implementation. They're just implementing.
The two departments report their finding to the House Department. Is the House
but they don't make the
Department
final. Nowhere in the legislation does it say that the House Committee
Senator
on
Joe
Education is making the final decision.
Senator Joe.
So I agree with you, Senator Taveri. Some colleges are instituting their own free speech campaigns, but some colleges still aren't, right?
Well, I said that in 2018, the number dropped to only 9 disinvitations, which was 43 in 2016. So clearly the trend is progressing, right? It's becoming better.
Okay, but what is the net harm of codifying this into law then? Like, why can't we just do it for the colleges that aren't doing it?
That's exactly. Well, because if you have a task force that's inherently tilted to the right, it's not going to ensure the free speech protections that are guaranteed.
Questioning time has elapsed.
I think the chair.
Everybody can go ahead and just remove their hand. We'll now go to the next affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers. Of those standing, that will go to Senator Bendock.
Thank you. Again, my name is Michael Bendock. I spoke second on the last bill if that helps you for my ballot. Just a thumbs up when you're ready would be perfect. Perfect. Partly ready? Great. One sec, let me just pin the PO. All right, perfect. In 1946, Roger Baldwin, the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, stated that in order to defend the people you like, you have to defend the people you hate. These words represent more than a First Amendment pipe dream. They represent the reality of what principled democratic discussion ought to be and the fruits it can yield. To protect the rights of Americans to speak in some of the most influential and open-minded communities that we have, please pass this bill because it is a step forward in granting our journey to eliminating the core ideas of bigotry in two ways. First, this bill prevents the censorship of controversial speech, preventing it from becoming more appealing. But I want to distance myself from Senator Tang because I do not think this bill decreases discourse. Instead, it just shifts it to another modem. Vince Heron of the UCLA Law School explains that censoring certain expressions makes them more rather than less appealing simply by virtue of censorship. The suppression of bigotry drives those ideas underground, allowing them to take on a life of their own while they are unchallenged by the rest of the community. Those driven underground are able to frame themselves as those who were oppressed by the establishment. The Southern Poverty Law Center explains that the KKK and Antifa and 1,000 other hate groups use this very rhetoric to increase their support and therefore increase their violent actions. By passing this piece of legislation and banning and ensuring that controversy is not banned, bigotry is exposed for what it really is. I want to address the concerns of Senator Javeri. At worst, Senator, this bill only protects conservative speakers who are usually banned from college anyway, without even restricting speakers on the left. But at best, Section 2 of this piece of legislation makes sure this Congress has oversight. Please pass this bill. But second, pass this piece of legislation to stimulate the practice of argumentative counter speech, which is important for reform. Charles Claros, a professor of the University of Arizona State University, finds that free speech can be a powerful instrument for reform, benefiting minorities, as counter speech, which is the form of discussion and demonstrations, exposes the moral bankruptcy of hateful ideas and spurs members of the campus to take voluntary action to combat hate and to remedy its ill effects. Let's look at my home state of Arizona. Arizona State University invited a racist speaker, and this spurred a campus revolution. They did four things. They held a public rally. They had a series of letters written in the newspaper. They had numerous workshops on race relations, and they added a course on American cultural diversity. But it is not just ASU. Hundreds of other universities, including Harvard and Stanford, have used counter speech to stimulate change. The negation is going to be concerned with violence, but I'm concerned of stopping that violence from happening in the first place. The only way to build a grassroots movement that tears out the roots of bigotry and hatred is to hear and respond to it. Let's protect the people that we hate to protect the people that we love. Please pass this bill.
Thank you for that speech. 3 minutes and 4 seconds. All questioners. Well, that will go to, is everyone there? Senator Boko.
Okay, so how exactly does this passing this legislation give Congress oversight?
Because Section 2A says the Department of Education will appoint 9 members, but in the first section, it says that there would be a task force composed of 18 members to report the House Committee on Education. So we have oversight.
How much oversight do we have if a majority of the members are coming from the executive branch's choice?
Wait, no, they're coming from the people that our constituents voted into office. It's Congress, not the executive branch.
The Attorney General is appointing
Senator Hurley.
That was a misclick. I apologize.
Okay, is there anybody? Senator Joel, you have the question.
Great speech, Senator. So does today's legislation make controversial speakers any less costly for colleges?
I'm not sure. I'm sure you can tell me.
Yeah, so it doesn't. So what incentive do colleges have to even invite controversial speakers in the first place if we pass?
I'm arguing that any incentive they have is protected under this piece of legislation. Incentive is non-unique. Protection.
Why
is
will they
unique
invite controversial speakers? Why will they do that if we pass?
As I said, to stimulate counter speech, and because you can't reject a student's
Do colleges
plea.
want protests on their campuses?
They don't want
Questioning
protests.
time
They want
has elapsed.
reform.
Questioning time has elapsed. You guys can go ahead and mute yourselves and put your hands down in the participant thing. We're now in line for a negation speech. All negative speakers. That'll go to Senator Joel if your hand's still up. There we go.
It is.
Senator Joel.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Joel speaking later than expected, but for the first time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so give me an indication when you're ready. A CNN survey found that nearly 10% of college graduates believe that Judge Judy serves on the Supreme Court. And while this might seem ridiculous, this Congress has taken it one step further. We believe that we are the Supreme Court. So first, fail because this bill amounts to an overstep of this Congress's constitutional power. This Congress is so dissatisfied with the lack of Supreme Court cases on college campus free speech that we've decided to ignore all separation of powers and hold the trial ourselves. Sections 2A and 2B essentially create a quasi-jury to apply the First Amendment in the disinvitation of controversial speakers. Only this jury is far from the objective body that the Supreme Court is. The ED and the Attorney General are both in the executive branch and are hence extremely partisan, as Senator Javeri points out. Any decision made by this committee will be tainted to its core with political bias. Our role is to create law, not interpret it. There is already a body to consider claims of that the First Amendment right is being infringed, and that is the judiciary. Take, for example, Young Americans for Freedom, which the Washington Times reports sued UC Berkeley in 2017 over the college's cancellation of Ann Coulter. YAF won the case, receiving $70,000, and Berkeley was forced to amend their regulations about controversial speakers. Legal pathways already exist for anyone who wishes to challenge the status quo. This Congress need not insinuate itself into affairs beyond its mandate. But second, fail today's legislation because it backfires by silencing all but the most controversial speech. Inviting controversial speakers is a huge risk for universities. The Pacific Standard reports that protests before Milo Yiannopoulos' 2017 speaking event cost $100,000. Berkeley had spent $800,000 on campus security for the event. In 2016, the school only spent $200,000 total for an entire year of campus security during speaking events. The only reason colleges take on this risk in the first place is because they still hold a way out in the form of a disinvitation, which can protect them from the most severe consequences of backlash. But today's legislation would force colleges to choose between three options: disinviting speakers and losing federal funding, allowing speakers to speak and incurring hundreds of thousands of dollars in expenses, or three, never inviting the controversial speakers in the first place. The choice is clear, and the chilling effect on speech will follow. Senator Zhao and Senator Bendock want open political discussion, but in a misguided attempt to promote diverse voices, they've done the exact opposite by creating a chilling effect on free speech, an environment where only universally embraced figures like Mr. Rogers will have a platform on college campuses. If the open forum of ideas is shut down due to the chilling effect this bill creates, it risks pushing students further into isolated echo chambers, usually online. And we know the violent and socially negative effects those have. Look, I'm all for embracing free speech, but because this bill does the exact opposite, vote to fail.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners? That will first go to Senator Hurley.
Hey, Representative, great speech. So I'm a little curious on this front. Does this legislation actually provide any substantive definition of controversy, like what a controversial speaker is?
No, it doesn't. But given the prevalency in the news, it's pretty easy to infer the legislative intent there.
So hypothetically, could we, so like with your example, would someone like only Mr. Rogers be the one that's excluded from that just because of how vague it is?
Yeah, so that example basically says that colleges will get so paranoid about who they're bringing on their campuses that they will only allow universally recognized figures.
Senator Bendock?
Thank you. Who enforces law, the Supreme Court or this Congress?
Okay, this Congress does, but when it comes to determining
That-
constitutionality, that's a job for the Supreme Court.
Right. So why can't this Congress uphold the rulings of the Supreme Court by passing this bill, by enforcing what the Supreme Court says?
So the Supreme Court actually hasn't ruled on college free speech. So what this Congress is
Wait,
doing
what's the
is
First
creating
Amendment?
its own
What
jury
is the
to
First
create
Amendment?
its own ruling.
Can
The
you tell
First
me what the
Amendment is
First
freedom of
Amendment is?
speech.
Okay,
It's freedom
so
of
they
speech.
have. They don't have to. It's in
So
the
we already have
Constitution.
legislation. So it's the Supreme Court's
Then we
job to
protect the
determine whether a
Question
First
time
Amendment violation
has
exists.
elapsed. Question time has elapsed. You guys can go ahead and turn your mics off. We're now in line for an affirmation speech. Just to let you guys know, we have a little bit more than like half an hour left with this session before the hard stop. So just keep that in mind. So of those that are standing, that will first go to Senator Khan.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Senator Isaac Khan, speaking for the second and last time today. Any signal when my judges are ready would be amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Feel ready?
Yes,
All right.
sir.
The factor that determines if something is trending in the world of social media and the reason why college speakers are often disinvited is the same cause. You can't stop talking about the matter. And while many view that factor as bad, I view it as the answer to today's debate. Talking about something, no matter its controversial level, allows for a marketplace of ideas, a continuous flow of knowledge, and at the basis of it, that is what colleges are meant to do, promote learning. Pass this legislation. So first, in a debate about university, it's almost ironic that everyone in this debate has ignored who this legislation directly affects, the students on campus. So allow me to be the first speaker to tell you that protecting free speech on university campuses by welcoming controversial speakers helps students attain a more well-rounded education both inside and outside of the classroom. Brad Pulcini, writing for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars, writes on November 21st, 2018, that the complex diversity of today's college campus gives rise to environments that are rich with opportunities for learning, personal growth, and meaningful interactions. Controversial speech on college campuses isn't a new phenomenon, and at the core of higher education's mission is equipping students with the tools with which to confront a host of different ideas. This is furthered by Kimberly Wilson, writing for The Courier on October 16th of 2018. She tells us that listening to viewpoints that they disagree with can help teach college students the invaluable skill of how to properly engage in difficult conversations. It's important for college students to be able to respect someone even if they disagree with an opinion that that person has. Listening to opposing viewpoints promotes tolerance and empathy. So whether you believe the controversial speaker's ideas or not, colleges have an obligation to promote learning. During our debate on the last bill, Senator Johnson and I both told you that the importance of civic engagement is crucial. And once again, that is an impact that we gain from affirming. Senator Javeri, Senator Joel, if you truly want to protect discourse, then you pass this legislation. We need to start amplifying voices instead of silencing them. But secondly, let's go line by line down the negation, because this Congress isn't going to need a task force investigation to see why you're going to vote on the affirmation. First, Senator Javeri tells us that the task force isn't going to be bipartisan. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and tell you that your political affiliation doesn't cloud your ability to see whether colleges are disinviting speakers or not. But even if you don't believe that, Jessica Levinson, a professor at La Jolla Law School, tells us that President Trump himself has signed executive orders stating that colleges and universities receiving federal grants have to support free inquiry. There is support for this policy on both sides of the aisle, Senator. But then Senator Joel tells us about how this chills discourse on university campuses. But the entire idea of this legislation is based upon allowing speakers we don't necessarily agree with to speak on campuses. And even if you're concerned about those costs for challenges, Margaret Watch writes on March 5th of 2019 that these types of events haven't become extravagantly expensive and colleges are able to afford those. Our democracy is built upon the foundations of free speech. The pen may be mightier than the sword, but only when we decide to pick it up. Pass this legislation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. Who is allowed to invite controversial speakers?
Right, that's like the college board, like the board of the college or professor.
Well, okay, administration, but also student groups, right? Say a student group wants to invite someone. What process do they go through?
I'm not sure of the exact process, but I know that like they file an application for the speaker to come to the campus approved by administration.
So you talk about the importance of education, right? What happens to college education when schools lose funding under today's legislation?
Schools aren't going to lose funding. There's no reason that they should be disinviting speakers.
Senator Javeri.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Khan. So if you have a task force that's inherently tilted to one side, how can you expect it to uphold a nonpartisan value?
Because the issue of disinviting speakers isn't based on partisan lines. First, there's support on both sides of the aisle, but secondly, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you should be able to see whether colleges are disinviting speakers.
The legislation itself is about creating the task force. So if the task force is inherently biased, what's the point of creating?
It's not inherently biased. Your
The
political
Attorney General of the
affiliation has
United
nothing to do with your
Questioning
ability to
time has
comprehend.
elapsed. Questioning time has elapsed. Senator Vyas, that's granted. We'll now be moving into a negation speech. All negation speakers. All right, of those standing, that will go to Senator Bokill.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Bokill, again, speaking for the last time today. Please just let me know when you're ready and if you can hear me all right. Awesome. Mr. Cox, are you good? I couldn't see you. Okay. When James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights in 1789, he wrote it to protect the Americans. But little did he know that societal thought would extend to a point where we are debating the extent of that protection. But at the point where we are clearly seeing unfair values, the debate ends there. I beg of you to stand with me and negate. The first reason why you're going to stand in negation is because of a lack of mental health resources. Now, Slate explains in September 5th of 2016 that legislation such as this one can pose a choice between free speech and safe spaces. But at the point where it could potentially harm someone, specifically college students, it's not really a choice anymore. CBS News, January 21st, 2018, expands on this by stating many controversial speakers could potentially not only say racial slurs, but triggering words as well that impact the psychological and mental health of numerous college students. To be more specific, NPR August 26 in 2016 explains why under today's society that's so detrimental. University of Chicago stated that they do not support trigger warnings to alert students of upcoming discussions or speakers they might find offensive or have past experiences relating to the issue. Why is this problematic? When you pass today's piece of legislation, like Representative Zoe said, we're essentially making sure that colleges invite these controversial speakers, but numerous colleges across our country have made it clear that they're not going to provide any type of trigger warning or help the psychological or mental health of the students. That becomes problematic because they're not prioritizing their own students in the first place. American Psychological Association in 2018 explains mental health services remain scarce in college, at a point where colleges are obviously choosing that they have to abide by the law over the safety of their students. And it's so controversial in the first place because of their own political ideology. We can't pass legislation like this one, enforcing it upon them and hurting the students in the long term. But now let's look at the misconceptions and problems with all of the arguments on the affirmation. Representative Zoe brought up this idea of polarization and how this piece of legislation can solve that. I have 3 arguments against that. First, you're not going to decrease polarization. If you think about it logically, you're going to increase it because the negation has already proved that the task force is fundamentally biased, as a majority of the task force is literally dependent on the administration and power. So depending on the time period and what the administration chooses, when they invite a certain controversial speaker, it's going to cause discourse in a negative manner. But second, this isn't the right way to create political discourse. Rather, we should support independent journalism sites. Network World in 2019 explains independent journalism sites are being more popular and are supported from college students because you can actually report hate speech or report any type of psychological trauma that you gain from a certain article that someone has posted. But thirdly, the fact of the matter is, if you actually want to create something fair or a certain task force, don't do it with people from the government. Do it from independent parties. Representative Farage said in questioning, it's simple to see if college is breaking the First Amendment. That's not true at all. The First Amendment is one of the most controversial things in our society today. Negate.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 13 seconds. All questioners. That will first go to Senator Zhao.
Hi, Senator. You consider yourself a liberal, right?
I mean, sure, if I'm allowed to say whatever I think.
Okay, sure, awesome. So if you were invited to speak to a group of conservatives, would you go there and just say a ton of stuff to insult them? Wouldn't you want to say like the best things possible to convince them to see your side of the point?
One second. I'm sure you've heard of Caitlin Bennett. She's a conservative. I don't know if you're like on TikTok, but you can see that she actually says a lot of things that trigger other people and have caused a lot of problem on college campuses.
Right, that's one instance out of many. Wouldn't you agree
Senator
that there
Tang?
are many conservatives?
Okay, so if we pass, does that mean that all like the colleges can't disinvite anybody, right?
Well, essentially, that's what's going to end up happening in the long term. Yeah.
But isn't the task force who decides who to disinvite?
That's what's problematic, right? The task force is literally made up of like the administration.
Yeah, I get it. It might be partisan, but you can tell if something is like going to cause violence, right? Like if someone's going to be triggering, the task force is going to
If you
tell.
believe in what they believe in, then you're not going to see it as violence. You're going to see it as like, oh, they're right, and like other people should learn this ideology. Like it's
Question time has elapsed. We'll now move into the next affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers. Is that everybody? Great. That will first go to Senator Farage.
I thank the chair. For everyone's reference, once again, for the final time in today's round, that's Senator Farage. It's spelled F-A-R-A-J. And I spoke pretty early on the last bill, if that helps you. But can I just get an indication from every judge, please?
Yeah, you spoke 7th on the last bill.
Yeah. Mr. Cox? Awesome. And that's all of my judges. Sorry, personal timer setup. Dissent is the core of democracy. A person should never be penalized just for speaking against popular opinion. But yet, hundreds of controversial speakers have been silenced at universities over the last decade. Pass this legislation, and that ends here. Let's recontextualize today's debate, because it seems that the affirmation isn't clear on what the biggest issue in the status quo actually is. The biggest issue is that a small minority are controlling college campuses in the status quo. Realize that this legislation isn't about protecting those who are unfit to speak. It's about protecting those who have already been deemed worthy by these college organizations. But the reason why this matters is explained by an October 2017 survey funded by the John Templeton Foundation, which finds that less than 2% of college students would ever protest or do something to inhibit a speaker on campus. There is a noisy minority who are making all of the decisions about what's going to be said and who's going to say it. And every other student is suffering because of it. But it's this small group that invokes the political recruitment Senator Zhao talks about and the violence that Senator Joel talks about. It's time we stop telling those whom we disagree with to shut up, and instead we step up and change this. But we need to realize what this legislation will actually do. The primary thing that it does is promote civil discourse. And now this is something that Senator Khan talked on, but I want to actually connect those links a little bit better. That's because the current culture at universities fosters fundamental misconceptions about American democracy. In fact, a September 2017 report released by Yale University finds that 1 out of every 5 students believe it is okay to use violence against speakers whose words can be considered offensive or harmful if it would get the speaker uninvited. Senator Javeri is absolutely correct. Violence should not be allowed to be used against controversial speakers. I also agree that meeting dissent with violence is not a response our universities should continue to enforce. But Senator Joel, I also understand your concern for funding security. Here's the thing, when we pass this legislation, we take away the entire incentive for protests to actually happen because students know that their violence and their outbursts will do absolutely nothing to get that speaker disinvited in the first place. Instead, we prepare students to act with civility instead of insensitivity. But next, Senator Bakil is concerned about trigger words and racial slurs. Realize, I don't want my constituents to ever be in a position where they feel powerless or vulnerable. But let's look at this point logically. If a student doesn't want to experience this trauma, they are not going to attend these speeches. Realize anxiety and trauma breed avoidance. Allow students to monitor themselves and ensure when they feel fit to attend these. At the end of the day, we must protect American democracy. That only happens in the affirmative world.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds on the dot. All questioners? That will first go to Senator Vias.
All right, thank you. So if colleges lose money from disinviting speakers, why would they invite them in the first place?
They're not going to disinvite them. That's the point. They know that they can invite these speakers, so they're literally just going to comply and they won't lose their funding.
But if they invite them and those speakers cause protests, which like causes like bad media on them.
So if you actually listen to my speech, I told you that this will stop protests because people realize that their violence isn't actually going to cause the speaker to be disinvited.
Right.
We
Is
take
that
away
the
that entire
reality of the
incentive.
status quo, or like a perfect world that we're striving?
This is the status
Senator Bokill?
Okay, so in my speech, I explained how colleges are stating they're not going to tell the students like whether if someone is coming, whether they're like potentially controversial or not.
Yeah.
So if the student doesn't know when they go to the speech and something happens, like why would we support this?
Here's the thing. People who have experienced trauma and anxiety develop a sense of avoidance. If they realize that they will be put in a position where that anxiety and trauma comes back up, they are going to avoid it. That's what they do.
Stereotype, right? Like that's not necessarily every single
No,
person.
that's literally what trauma does to your brain.
Question time has elapsed. We're now in line for negation speech on negative speakers. Just give you guys one more second. That will go to Senator Mehta.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. That's Senator Mehta, MEHPH. Let me know when you're ready. Thank you. Everyone good? Awesome. Thank you. Whether we bleed red or blue, it is a privilege that we get to use our voices for discourse today. But not everyone has that opportunity. Not one negative speaker on my side has actively advocated for a suppression of free speech. But we advocate to fail today's legislation because all it does is put barriers to accessing free speech in the future. There are too many issues in this legislation for us to actively pass today's bill. So let's ask ourselves some key questions and understand why the negative wins today's ballot. First, is the committee proposed in the legislation effective? First brought up by Senator Javeri and furthered by Senator Joel. Both entities appointing the task force members, they say, are going to be subject to partisan bias. That's absolutely true. And that's not really been a point of contention in today's debate. In fact, I'll even take the affirmative at their highest ground and admit that Trump's administration is uniquely polarized. But when we pass today's legislation, we set a precedent for unfair protections for controversial speakers of the president's party, whatever it may be. But Senator Khan dismisses this concern by saying political affiliations don't matter in context of controversial speakers. But he could not be more far from the truth. Keep in mind, the task force doesn't just determine if the speaker was disinvited. They begin investigating why. And that's when issues of hate speech subjectivity and political leaning come into play. Note, the affirmative has not once offered any justification as to why the Attorney General and the Department of Education are uniquely best suited to elect members to the task force. But my side has been telling you from the beginning of today's debate that we want to uphold free speech. So let me propose a counter solution that takes the affirmative's concerns into regard. The House Committee on Education in the Workplace, literally overseeing this legislation, is very, very bipartisan. Maybe they can convene to elect the bipartisan committee or act as a committee themselves, so that regardless of party affiliation, we are making the right decision. But next, ask ourselves, is funding an issue? I'm so glad that Senator Joel brought up this point. He's absolutely right. Colleges really don't have any political stake in disinviting controversial speakers. They literally can't afford security protections that come with controversial speakers. He mentioned UC Berkeley, who has spent $4.8 million on security. That's the issue today. But again, my side has been striving for the same values as the affirmation from the beginning. So let me propose another counter solution that takes care of the flaw in the bill. Let's allocate more funding as a Congress towards schools that host controversial speakers so they don't have to bear the brunt of the cost. So our students are kept safe and colleges are encouraged to keep controversial speakers on campus. When we do these acts, we will access all of the affirmative impacts. Senator Bendock's on reducing hate speech, Senator Zhao's on political polarization. Ultimately, we are all one, regardless of our party, and we better start acting like it and fail today's legislation. Let's fix the flaws in the bill and let's start upholding free speech the right way.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. All questioners. That will first go, oh, wow, okay. I'll go to Senator Khan.
Hi, so I'm still confused about this political affiliation thing, because if we can find just from a simple Google search speakers who have been disinvited, why won't our federal government be able to either?
So like I said in my speech, it's not an issue about determining who's been disinvited. That's out there for public knowledge. They launched an investigation as to why the speaker was disinvited. And if the speaker was disinvited on proper grounds, for example, inciting hate speech or inciting campus violence, that's when political leaning comes into play, because that's where the parties are.
But insofar as it's just about discourse, wouldn't anyone be able to see that?
Senator Farage?
No.
Senator, going off of that last line of questioning, what is the actual functional purpose of this committee that's appointed?
They're launching investigations into speakers who have been disinvited.
Right, but their point is that they're making sure that colleges are complying with this legislation, right?
Right.
No. Okay, yeah, so if that's just the point, then why is bias such a huge factor? They literally just have to say, did they comply or did they not?
Because when determining if they complied, they have to see if they disinvited the speaker.
It's a yes or no question. Why is opinion so important?
With that, the questioning time has elapsed. We will now move into an affirmative speech. Just a reminder, we have close to like 15 minutes, a little bit more than that before the session does come to a hard stop. Of those standing, we have Senator Smith. You have the floor.
I thank the chair. I am Senator Smith, speaking for the second and final time today. I'll begin with judges. Pio and Hurley are all ready. Perfect. Thank you so much. Second judge, we're ready. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Point of order. Could the PO just like remind me what speaker she was in the previous debate?
I have Senator Smith as the 10th speaker. Oh no, sorry, 9th speaker.
And was I the 10th speaker?
Yeah.
Oh, apologies. That's my bad. Sorry about that.
No problem. That's why we got the spreadsheet going. All right, whenever you guys are ready.
All right, thank you so much. Through this debate, I have been a little bit confused, mostly because of the definition of controversial speaking under Section 1 of this piece of legislation. Now, under Section 1, if you invite your attention there, it says that a task force shall be established to investigate First Amendment freedom of speech claims against all Title IV degree granting institutions that disinvite a controversial guest speaker. That means that's something that the AF and NEG have not mentioned yet. When a university is inviting a controversial speaker, they know that this speaker is controversial. They know the repertoire, they know what they're going to speak on, and they know the values of their students. If they are inviting a speaker to their university that is controversial, they know that. This piece of legislation is only investigating controversial speakers who have been disinvited. According to USA Today on January 4th, 2018, most controversial speakers who have been disinvited from universities are because of safety threats to the speakers, the campus staff, or the students. There is absolutely no reason that we shouldn't be pushing this piece of legislation, since it's going to only be protecting students. Controversial speakers are going to be invited to universities, both in the AF and NEG world. And when we pass today's legislation, we protect our constituents and the universities which they're attending. But if that's not enough to convince you why we're standing on AF today, I'd like to speak to Senator Joel's point of constitutionality. While he is arguing that it is not constitutional for us, the US Congress, to nominate a task force in order of upholding the US Constitution, that's something that we need to take into perspective. We have all sworn to protect the Constitution as a member of Congress, and we are doing every effort to do that. If we believe that by passing this piece of legislation, we are going to help our constituents, it is then up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not it is constitutional. So even if we can pass this legislation, we know it's going to help our constituents, we should. Next, to Senator Boakhill's point on mental health and trigger words. The goal of a university is not to alienate their students, especially not with a controversial or aggressive large group setting. You don't want to have a group of students being yelled at by a controversial speaker. Someone with a strong political views or past mental health issues due to any type of PTSD who would be triggered if a controversial speaker, which would be extra aggressive, will be aware of the political affiliations of the university that they're attending. They'll be aware of the political affiliations, red or blue, of the group or club that has invited a controversial speaker to speak to them. If they are not comfortable sitting in that audience, in that position, listening to another person's political views for whatever reason, they are able to get up and leave. And they will be aware of the controversial views before the speech starts, as Senator Farage previously stated. Now, Senator Joel, Jarvi, and Marita have all stated that this is going to be a completely partisan creation and completely partisan member nation, but that doesn't matter. The US government is in charge of keeping our constituent states safe, and we can only do that when we affirm.
Thank you for the speech of 3 minutes and 12 seconds. All questioners. That will, is that everybody? Okay, that will go first to Senator Hurley.
Hey, Representative, great speech. So you mentioned that controversial speakers usually get disinvited because of threats of violence or whatever else. So why is this legislation necessary if then no one's actually going to get punished for disinviting, if they can link it to that?
Yep. So if this legislation is specifically necessary because when they're being disinvited, it's usually on risks of different safety issues, right? So the task force should be able to investigate that and then help the universities take any action needed to make sure that that was the correct reason.
Can you cite an instance in which someone was removed just
Senator Javeri?
Hi. So your response to the argument that it's partisan isn't responsive. You just said that it's our duty to protect the citizens. How does that respond to the argument that our justice system or the task force we're assembling is inherently biased, as multiple speakers, including myself, have proved?
Yep, so I understand why you're saying that the president is the one who is putting those people appointed on top of the task force who's making the 18 people. But the US federal government always has the safety of our constituents in mind, or at least that should be our goal. And when
how does that respond to the argument that it's partisan? Right?
It doesn't matter whether or not it's partisan or not. It's
questioning time.
But isn't that the goal of the legislation?
The questioning time has elapsed. And we'll just move right into the next affirmative, negation speaker. All negative speakers. That will, of those two, that will go to Senator Wang.
I thank the chair. For my judges, that's Wang, spelled W-A-N-G. Any indication when you guys are ready? Perfect, perfect. Great. We pride ourselves in living in a country where people are not ashamed to speak freely, where debate is encouraged and opinions are valued. And although I would love to say that today's legislation is enough to protect controversial speakers, in reality, it only provides an alternative that takes us back to where we are right now. First, investigating First Amendment claims encourages self-censorship. Perhaps the most important question we ask ourselves is, will colleges be pressured to avoid legal investigations? And the answer is yes. The Ms. Canson Center explains in 2019 that spring commencements were far less likely to be disinvited than in previous years because of the decision of administrators to only invite non-political speakers. Senator Zhao, you have stressed the importance of threatening federal funding. Senator Smith says that speakers will be invited in both the AF and NEG world. However, this is inherently false. As Senator Vaya suggests in questioning with Senator Farage, investigating universities for disinviting controversial speakers incentivizes schools to not invite these speakers in the first place. Now, Senator Bokill does a great job of explaining how Senator Zhao's argument about polarization actually falls to the negation. There should be no question about this because the effects she talks about are already happening. USA Today reports that rarely any clearly aligned Republican political figure spoke at commencements. Universities are growing increasingly leery of inviting conservative speakers who create more controversy with largely left-leaning student bodies. This results in the exact opposite of the affirmative's hope of a more open-minded university. Students will be limited in exposure to controversy that they will not be protected from post-college. Now, the second question we ask ourselves is, how are students affected? The answer is that they are placed with financial burdens. Colleges won't be investigated for violations if they are not the ones blocking the controversial speakers. The Washington Post explains in 2018 that universities have told student groups that they needed to pay thousands of dollars in security fees. The fee was required by Universities Policy 2230, which authorizes imposing a speech tax. In the Supreme Court case of the University of Wisconsin System versus Southworth, the court ruled that universities would impose a mandatory student activity fee, which could be used for groups that were found offensive. Having task force means that universities will require student groups to provide security funding at rates that administrators know they can't afford. Claims for funding and locational barriers do not violate First Amendment rules. As a result of Section 1 of today's legislation, universities will be incentivized to use these claims to save themselves from being subject to further investigation. This only furthers the divide between student groups and school administrators when students are placed with a financial burden under today's legislation because the schools themselves don't want to be involved with legal complications. Realize that passing today's legislation only takes us back to square one.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 54 seconds. All questioners. Give me 1 second. The whole thing just shut down. Okay. Of those, we'll start with Senator Donaldson.
Hi, when college administrators feel uncomfortable making a decision on who to have come and speak, why wouldn't we want to put it in a panel who doesn't have a direct link or personal claim to the institution?
Okay, here's the thing. I think we can both agree that colleges prioritize themselves first. They want to make sure that they're not involved with legal complications. If that means not inviting
How many
speakers, then that's
protests
okay.
actually happen on campus for colleges to put security forces in place?
Well, right now they're using that as an excuse. That's the thing.
10%. They can't justify that on a legal board, right?
It doesn't violate First Amendment rules for colleges to require
Senator Zhao.
And that's what they're using as an excuse.
Senator Zhao.
My bad. Sorry, I was muted. Hi, Senator Wang. So
Hi.
who usually invites controversial speakers in college campuses?
Okay, this is kind of the same question I asked another representative, Senator. So basically, school administration can invite controversial speakers for things like commencements, but student body groups can also invite controversial speakers.
What is more common, like one commencement speaker per year, or like tens or hundreds of like guest speakers throughout the year?
Okay, I think I know where you're going with this. Even if a student group, that's the basis of my second point. Even if a student group poses a question where they want to invite controversial speakers, the school administration can still shut them down with funding barriers.
And with that, the questioning time has elapsed. And due to the hard stop, is that a motion, Senator Hurley?
Motion to move to the previous question.
Is there a second? I think we do have some speakers left, do we not?
Point of inquiry.
State that inquiry.
Doesn't this session technically end at 5:32? We still have time for one more speech.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. We do have one more speech, so I was just making sure everybody's spoken. So let's just move into that. I'll just call for all affirmative speeches. Out of those two, that speech does go to Senator Zhao.
I thank the chair. Hi, this is Senator Zhao for the last time today, still spelled ZHAO. As always, thumbs up, smile, nod from you guys would be great. Great, awesome, perfect. My video is always ready, wonderful. As Montesquieu once said, there's no greater tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice. Unfortunately, for far too long, We have perpetrated the violation of our constituents' First Amendment rights under the shield of the law. And it is time for us to right that wrong. It is time for us to pass. As the last speaker in today's debate, allow me to prove to you why your vote ultimately falls to the affirmation. And that's because all of the problems that the negation brings up to you actually have a root cause that this legislation solves for in the first place. Senator Joel, your concern of colleges being forced to pay expenses for protection wouldn't exist if more empathy in the political discourse realm existed in the first place. Senator Bockel, the assumption that all conservative speakers are going to spew racial slurs is a misconception born out of the lack of political discourse. Ultimately, the underlying issue in our society today is a lack of open discourse, and the affirmation solves. The American Psychological Association quotes the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt in May of 2016, who says that liberals and conservatives' different morals leads to misunderstanding between the two groups. And this is what has led to polarization, distrust, and extremism. In the status quo, the only reason why things have gotten as bad as they have is because we are pushing each other further and further away from each other. And that is from a refusal of not listening. However, today we have the opportunity to attack the root cause of this issue. And the long-term impact of that is a complete restructuring of the landscape of political discourse. As congressmen, we embody the very virtue of settling and resolving conflicts through discussion and debate. It is only right that we cast a vote in the affirmation today. But next, let's address some of the biggest concerns of the negative today, which is championed by Senator Javeri and Senator Mehta, who talk about their concern over the credibility of the task force that will be implementing today's legislation. Senator Smith has offered you one response to this concern, but allow me to offer you another one. Past precedent has literally shown and proven that when it comes to a topic as integral to American democracy as free speech, those in power actually set aside partisan biases. According to official court documents, most cases dealing with First Amendment right to freedom of speech have had a unanimous decision have came to a unanimous decision, 9-0. To name some of the earliest cases, we have Schneck versus the United States, Abrams versus the United States, and Debs versus the United States. And some of the most recent, we have Ashcroft versus the ACLU, Virginia versus Hicks, where all of the decisions were unanimous. Representatives, it is time that we finally end the perpetration of injustice under the shield of the law, and we only do that in an affirmative world. We can trust that this legislation is going to be implemented correctly and fairly, because we know that the task force understands the gravity of their responsibility. And when they understand that gravity, they will set aside their partisan biases and do their job, which is to ensure justice and equality for all of our American constituents. And that only happens in an affirmative world. Pass.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. All questioners. Is that all the questioners? Oh, wow. Okay. So that will first go to, let's see here. That will go to Senator Bendock.
Thank you. We're both on the same side, so let's clear up some of the negative concerns. Is this task force going to be partisan?
No, their implementation.
Why not?
No. Well, I just proved to you. Past precedent shows that when people are put in decisions to make important decisions as important as this one, they set aside their partisan biases.
Let's believe the negation and say that it is going to be partisan. Why is that not a bad thing?
It's not a bad thing because at the end of the day, like, we're still going to have equality.
Yeah.
Because
So isn't it better to
still opening
protect
up
some speakers than none?
Definitely. I 100% agree.
Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. What's the root cause of college administrators asking student groups for funding?
They don't have money.
No, it's because they don't want certain controversial speakers to come to their campus because when a problem occurs, they don't want it to ruin their reputation. Today's legislation only makes that worse by threatening funding, right?
The only reason why a problem would occur in the first place is because of the lack of open political discourse, which we cannot solve for unless we pass today's legislation.
Okay, I'll just assume that you're correct on that. But still, when controversial speakers come to their campus,
that ends the questioning period.
I thank the chair.
Seeing as how we basically reached our hard stop, I'll just unilaterally move to a motion for the previous question. Those in favor of passing this legislation, please just put your hand up. On the participant thing, yeah. Otherwise, unless those are motions. I don't think there should be any motions anyway. Yeah. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And all those against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. So with a vote of 6 to 9, this legislation does fail. Is that a motion, Senator Hurley? Say that motion.
I move to adjourn.
Any seconds? Yeah. All right. So just to wrap up, guys, you all did amazing. Just from the PO standpoint, I tried my best to be as transparent as possible. You guys can see all your questions and everything on the spreadsheet, which I hope was helpful because that's something new that I started doing with TOC. But other than that, for the judges, if you think that I did a good job running an efficient and good chamber, which I hope I did, then just please feel free to rank me as well. And for those of you who move on to the final round, congratulations. It's the TOC final round. You all deserve it for sure. And I just can't wait to see how good you guys do. Thank you, guys.
Congrats, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before you all hop off, I would just like to say a couple quick things. First of all, congratulations again on making TOC semifinals. It's a really big deal. You all did a great job, and it was such a pleasure to be your parliamentarian today. And for those of you who this is your last tournament and the journey stops here, I want to congratulate you on a really successful career, and I hope that you had a great experience. I'm sorry that we're not all together in Kentucky, but at least we are together virtually, and we were still able to have this experience. So I want to congratulate you all and thank you for a wonderful semifinal chamber. Ursula, did you have something to add? I see that you popped on.
Oh, yes. I just really wanted to tell this chamber that I am so impressed with the way that you handled the technical difficulties this morning, just allowing for each other to speak and to ask questions. And then, this afternoon, things seemed to be going smoother, and it was just, I work in tab a lot and I never get to see this much debate because I'm always stuck in the back, and these rounds are so awesome. You guys are at such an amazing level of debate. So thank you because I got to lurk and watch you all this afternoon and it was awesome.
Thank you for all the tabbing you do for us.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Parley. Thank you, judges.
Thank you.
Bye.
Carly, will we get a ballot from you or no?
I was able to do ballots in the second session, but they didn't give me ballots for the first session. So you will get comments from me in the second session.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ursula, do you need anything from me before
It was exciting. You got the most exciting session of Congress.
I know.
No, I mostly just wanted to say hi.
Oh, hi. Should I stop streaming? I think we're still live.
Oh.
I'll go ahead and stop streaming.